Hey folks, Steve here with a special GameON 2022 debrief video. This video is certainly going to be long, but what I'm going to aim to do is find the times where I start talking about a different section or game of all the topics we're going to cover here, and I'm going to put the timestamps down below in the description. So if you don't care about a particular game I'm going to talk about, you want to see the full table of contents, you can check the description, you can jump right to those sections that you care about. And yeah, it being a long video, I can understand if folks just aren't interested, but I wanted to do this as a debrief to kind of talk to everything that happened at the con with a week's time having have passed, basically, or close to a week, because if you wanted to, you can go back and watch the short videos that I did where I sort of gave a snapshot in time of, hey, here's how things are going. But this video is for after the fact, after I've had time to let things settle in my mind. Obviously, initial opinions right off the cuff from a game I was playing have had time to gel, and I can kind of reflect. And, a week later, what kind of conversations am I having with friends? What kind of things am I thinking about after the fact to kind of put some additional framing around that whole thing? So we'll be talking about a number of games in this video. I'll probably do a couple of different cuts. So for you, that should be pretty easy in terms of the editing and what you guys see. But just understand, again, that we're going to go through a lot of different topics today, and I'm more or less organized, but there you go. Once more, I'm using Reluctant Enemies as a backdrop here. The plexiglass is back in place. I did take this plexiglass with me to the convention, but it's back on top of the map here. First thing I want to talk about just quickly is the general management of the convention and the venue. So as always, Jeff Newell and the guys who run that convention, did a great job. Everyone got souvenir GameON mugs that I should have brought mine here into the room, but I guess I forgot to do that, but that's okay. Which was just kind of fun, and just in general, they did a good job with running the convention and keeping it a fun atmosphere and a still very local, small community feeling convention. And that's something important, because sometimes you get these really, really big conventions and it just becomes kind of a wild affair of just a lot happening, and you're searching through masses of people for people you know. Here at GameON, it's always this very community-driven thing. Like, everybody knows each other, or maybe played games with each other before. You still have opportunities to meet people or play games with people you haven't before, but you're inevitably going to run into some of the same folks, especially if you've been going year after year. And there's definitely a desire to keep that small, community, friends and family feel to the convention, even if it had the opportunity to grow. Maintaining that close-knit community is a really good thing in general. So that was all really great. The venue was good. The room itself was fine. I did stay at the hotel that the convention was at. And the food ordering was actually really great. They implemented this new system where each game table and assigned game table had a sign posted on it that included a QR code that you could scan and open up a tab, make orders, keep that tab open, order more food or drinks or whatever throughout the day, and then close your tab, whenever you were ready to. And if you were changing tables, you could close your tab and open up a new tab immediately. And I'll say that system worked pretty darn well, and it had to have been the most convenient way to do this sort of food while you're gaming at any convention I've ever attended, ever. I mean, it just was so slick. I don't know if anyone had any trouble or issues. I had none. Everything was like, boom, I put in an order for a drink. It came out pretty quick. I put in an order for food when it came out. It was pretty much coming right to where it needed to. Maybe, a server kind of had to look around, but if you knew what you ordered, hey, raise your hand, flag them down. That's over here. So whether it was, getting beers for my buddy and I, or just ordering food, that made it just the easiest thing in the world, not having to wait for a server to come by, or be interrupted during a game to be asked a question if anybody wanted anything. You just, when you wanted it, you put the order in, they brought it to you. We joked about, hey, this place brings you beer. It's pretty great. And of course, made sure to tip well, because they're still bringing you the food. They're still hauling the food upstairs often to deliver food. So that was something that, those hardworking folks did what they did, and it all worked really great. Everybody was pretty safe, in terms of like wearing masks unless you were eating food or whatever, and it was just generally really good. I mean, for being in a pandemic, still, all those given conditions, I mean, it ended up being a really good way to do all of the gameplay and be able to, eat and not starve, and handle the fun. So that was all really great. So I'm going to run through all the games that I played roughly in the order that I started playing them, because I have had, across the couple of days there early in the convention, I was hopping between the Mighty Endeavor and other stuff, just due to Justin's availability and my availability to get together and actually play the game, which is a really good time to just call out. I'm going to mention Justin a couple of times in this video. His YouTube channel has a title of Justegard, Justegarde. I'll put a link to his channel in the description below. I mentioned him a number of times throughout those videos, so if you've not subscribed to his channel or checked out his stuff, I really do encourage you to do so. Justin is a great guy. And to that point, Justin was a lot of fun to game with. He's a really good guy to game with. In general, I've played games with him before, and I ended up playing a lot of games with him over the convention. And he's just a great guy to work with in terms of, understanding rules and figuring things out, and conducting the play of whatever it is that you're playing, whether it's something complex or not so much. So we're going to talk about the Mighty Endeavor first. So this was the first game. We were technically the first game at the convention. We technically started on day 0, Tuesday night. We were the first ones rolling dice. So there was another game table that was getting set up, but they weren't going to start until Wednesday. We started getting rolling that night. We got set up. Now, some of that was due to my deft preparation, where I had all the counters sorted. I had them sorted by turn reinforcement. I had them sorted even by some logistical things at start, so it was just a little bit easier to get everything put together. Just having that enabled us to get pretty organized, and we were rolling dice that night, which was really, really key. And I guess I'll just keep this out and open for a second. I'm probably going to reference a couple of rules as we chat here. So, in general, I would say that the Mighty Endeavor was the highlight of the convention for me. Now, that's not to say that the other games weren't a lot of fun. They definitely were. Don't get me wrong, but I think, when I think about like what was the big thing for this convention that sticks out in my mind, it's definitely going to be the Mighty Endeavor. Now, I think we ended up playing for over 20 hours altogether. That started Tuesday night, we played Wednesday night, and then all day Thursday. We kind of got started later on Thursday, but we played, I think, during the nighttime sessions of the game we were playing. I think we were going up to like midnight every night. So it was, we hit it really hard. We knocked it out. We played through all the turns. And, it took to the end to really determine who was the winner, and there's all sorts of things tied up, and I wish I could have done better, but I think I put up a good fight, and we had a good time playing it. So, I mean, the way that I felt about this leaving the convention was, boy, that was a lot of fun. I'd like to try it again. I'm a little concerned about the East Front. I've had a week to let that kind of germinate in my head about, well, what do I really think, and how do I think about this game ultimately? Well, my emotions or my thoughts stay true across this week, where I definitely look at this and I can say this was definitely still the highlight. There were other games that were close, but this was definitely man, I'm really glad I took the time to play this. It was a bigger game. Realizing that SCS is not terribly complicated, which is the game series that this is a part of, or here it is, Standard Combat Series. It's not terribly complicated. This game does ratchet up the complexity, and I would say, just in terms of the special supply rules that the Western Allies have to follow, and all the different sort of game rules that are involved there in the expansion, that It's certainly one of the more complicated or complex SCS games, and it's probably the only one that I'm going to get and keep, right? Like, I don't think I'm going to get other SCS games, but this one definitely hits a nice sweet spot that it's a pretty big game when you look at all the maps together. There's a fair number of counters in play. The action is still meticulous. You're still moving counters. You're determining odds. You're figuring out what you want to do. But it's not breaking your back. I think there's a couple of points where, for the Western Allies, when you have to count supply from a port through the trucks to the HQ and then the units and all of that, like that can be a little tricky, where you need to make sure that as you advance, you're setting up your truck convoys appropriately. Like, it was just enough to be like, yeah, I really need to think about this, and logistics are my bottleneck as the Western Allies, as it should be. But I never really felt like, oh, this is so laborious that I'm not having fun. So it managed to be, a consistently smooth playing experience. My only regret is that I think a couple of times we were playing rules wrong. Now, when you put it all together, how I was hurt was probably offset by some of it helping in different ways and just implementing rules incorrectly. So it's kind of a wash from that perspective. But my big takeaway was like, I want to play this again. I really, really would like to play it again. I might even just want to play it again as the Western Allies and the Eastern Germans again, so that I can, one, fix my mistakes that I made as a tactical player, and ensure that I'm playing the game with the rules correctly from the get-go. Because I think there was, I'm going to reference the rules here in particular. There's something like, you have to, excuse me, here it is, Allied supply. So it talks about being able to trace what is effectively 5 movement points, back to a truck. And if you look at everything across the truck rules, you'll see it references 5 movement points, 5 movement points here, all throughout. And there were a number of turns, thinking back, where we were counting hexes, and due to the roads being half a movement point, there was like a turn or two where I felt like I couldn't even advance, and I was trying to figure out. I'm like, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Like I couldn't get very far. I got as far as I could go, and I spent a turn there just kind of evening out the line and trying to make some breakthroughs, but thinking, well, that's weird. I can't advance any further. Like, am I just missing? I need to get another truck reinforcement, and then I can keep pushing. Is that what I'm missing? Do I need to finish taking Marseille and then send the extra truck up? Is that how I get over to Western Germany? And it was that question where I was like, oh, something's not right. That I looked at the rules, and indeed, it was 5 movement points, not hexes. And once I figured that out, I was able to start attacking again and extend, I was able to get movement. And you still have challenges because you need to figure out how you're going to count to each truck. And as you start getting into Germany, you're going to have to be careful, where things are getting where and which HQs are tracing where, back to which ports, and that whole thing. But it definitely felt like I lost some momentum because I felt like I couldn't go further. But the reality was, oh yes, I should have, and I should have moved forward, and I should have, penetrated deeper in my liberation of France, and I sort of lost that, which really sucked. Now, would that have made the game any better for me in terms of winning? I don't know. And maybe I would have gotten a few more victory points. But so much of that, it was fine. What I really liked about the game in general, and this is almost like a mini review, but again, it's like I want to keep something in reserve because I feel like I need to play it once more as the Western Allies and Eastern Germans, and then maybe even play it again as then the opposite side and see what I think about it. And you guys know, if you watch my channel enough, I'm not usually playing games multiple times before reviewing, but I think just for this one, there's just a lot of feelings encased in what I experienced that I really want to put it through its paces before I can really ever do, a true review. But the thing is, I like the game a lot. So, again, it's got attack factors, defense factors on units and movement, basic stuff. It's got the exploit. All the systems come together pretty well. Air is simple but intuitive. Terrain is a factor. You're figuring out ways to navigate the terrain. Everything from a Western front feels really good. Where I had trip-ups was the Eastern Front, where, all the rules for the Eastern Front are part of the expansion rules. And ultimately, you have to, it's very strange. If you're figuring out how to play the Eastern Front, you have to look at the series rules, which are still in the box. I didn't bring those out. You have to kind of look at this, but only some of it applies, and other parts are overwritten by the expansion rules. And I think Justin and I were very frequently, at least I was, I'll speak for myself, I guess, I was very frequently having to flip between all three rulebooks just to make sure I understood this is what I could or could not do, or how the Eastern Germans are going to operate compared to what their Western counterparts were capable of doing. The really painful part of this expansion part of the game are these crippled remnants. So the Soviet player rolls 1 die for each Axis unit arriving via East map entry marked with the asterisk. Now, to be clear, this is most of the units that come on to the map for the Eastern Front. And you can see you're basically just rolling a die roll. And, a third of the time, no losses. 15% of the time, or 13%, I think it's 13%, whatever it is. You lose a whole unit, and then otherwise you're losing a step. So the majority of the results are going to be your units are beat up. And if you're getting single step units, then that's a 66% chance that they're just going to be gone. And you're going to roll for that for the Axis units, not the Soviet units. The Soviet units are basically untouched coming into the game. And to be clear, at the beginning of the game, for the first few turns, there are no units on the East map. So if you're playing the full combined game, you and your opponent are going to be playing the West Front only, really, for a couple turns, and then the Germans start to retreat into the map, and you have an opportunity as the Eastern German player to try to set up your defensive line. The other weird part of the East Front is, let's see what it is, the HQ activation. So you got to roll a die, and if it's a 5 or a 6, you can flip the HQ to its attack side as the Soviets. So you can save that, you can choose not to use it and wait until you get a bunch of offensives, or you can use it and go. The other weird thing is that the Soviets can't move to a place that would put them out of supply. So there's this weird dynamic where, let's just think about the bands of possibility here. When you're playing the combined game, it is effectively the Western Allied player against the Soviet player racing to get victory points. That's ultimately the task. And the German player is played, or the German faction is played by both players, right? You're just playing defense. So there is an element of, if you're playing the Western Germans and the Soviets, like, yes, delaying the Western Allies means that you're going to keep their victory point level low. So that's one element of victory that certainly matters a lot. But for the East part of the game, so much of the framing of the game are around these die rolls that the players have no influence over. Now, you might say, Steve, that it's a war game. You're rolling dice all the time. That's what is going to kind of govern some things. Well, that's true, but on the West Front, your die rolls are coming from the attacks you've chosen to execute, or not executed, as the case may be, or whatever, right? Like, when you roll dice, you've made some risk management decision on, I'm willing to sacrifice some step losses to conduct this attack and hope that I've beaten the Germans back to some degree. In the East Front, you still have that. Don't get me wrong. There's elements of, are the German units going to do a counterattack? Are the Soviets going to attack in certain places? Where are you going to get to? But the whole setup of those reinforcements, where it's like, as the Eastern German, I have no choice. I'm just going to lose units is what's going to happen. I'm going to get a lot of units beaten up. If I luck out and all of my really good units come in unscathed, it's not because I did anything good, and it's not because the Soviet player did anything particularly interesting. So I could have a really strong German East Front that comes into the map. I could have an insanely threadbare one, or maybe it all averages out and I've got, a third that are untouched and a majority that have taken a step loss, and then some small percentage that are completely eliminated. But again, the reality is you could have some big swings in what those results are looking like. Now, for the Soviet side, you have something equally swingy. You could have a lot of HQs activate. You could have you could have a lot of HQs activate frequently. You could have HQs that activate very infrequently. Now, again, you could say, if you look at the die roll and you figure out the percentage, there's probably a normalized percent that you're going to get some activations on any given turn. On any given turn, a third of your HQs will activate. Now, over the course of the game, the Soviets will get more HQs, and they will tend to start getting closer together so that if you can't activate one HQ, you might be able to activate a different one, and the overlapping supply or command range of the HQs will mean that some part of your line will still get to activate and do a lot of damage. But what's interesting was that in Justin I's game, in the last couple of turns of the game, there was like a turn or two where none of his HQs activated at all. So the most he could do was move, which is still valuable, don't get me wrong, but he couldn't really attack. Now, those couple of turns might have made the difference to where he could have taken Berlin. Now, he didn't need to. He still won the game by several victory points, but if I had not made my rule mistakes and I had played a little bit better, I might have been, I might have had the edge of victory points, and his failure to activate, which he has no control over, might have meant that he either won or lost by taking Berlin. Because so much of the weight of the Soviet power feels like as long as they activate, they're going to make a lot of progress. And if you don't control when you activate, then the game's not really up to your decision, is it? You don't control what's happening. The counterpoint to that, because you can tell I've been thinking this through, is, well, you have to operate in the game knowing that that's going to be the case. So you need to simply be a good player by managing when you don't get the HQs, when you do get the HQs, and still making the best tactical decisions you can make on any given turn. I suppose that's still the case, right? That's true, yes. But it feels awfully strange to have so much out of your hands that, if you got hot dice and the Soviets activate frequently, they'll be in Berlin way ahead of schedule, and the game is going to be set and match. Now, we had a few onlookers for our game who said as much. They said, yeah, we played this game, but with the expansion, the Soviets are in Berlin every time super early. And just because it didn't happen in our game doesn't mean that could happen a decent number of times in playing the game. So part of the reason why I want to play again is to have that opportunity to play it again, to see, if we say Justin got roughly average results, and he got close to Berlin. I mean, they were coming in on him. You say that's a pretty good result, right? Like, that's pretty close. That seems right. Well, if we played again and it's a raffle stomp and the Soviets are in Berlin super early, then that's going to show again some weird pacing issues. Now, the one thing that I've not done, and now that I'm saying it, I feel like I should have done this before recording this video. So this is my bad, guys. What I would like to understand is what are the maximum number of victory points on the East map? What are the maximum victory points on the West map? And if they're the same, or if they're different, how does that factor in? So I'll put it this way, like, if the Soviets take everything, right, they do very well, and maybe you're on turn like 20 of 25, and the Soviets have taken everything, is there a point to the Western Allied player still playing the game, right? Like, do you call it early or not? If there are enough victory points on the board that it's worth continuing, then you should continue, right? Like, the East Front is over. That game is over. The Soviets aren't allowed to cross a particular line on the map, which is a little weird of a gamey thing, but like, if you just go with it, right, and say the Soviets can only go so far, and the Western Allied player can make it a draw by getting enough victory points or capturing every victory point on the western part of the map, then the game's probably still worth playing, right? Because you'd rather draw than lose, or you're just getting tired of the game and you say, fine, Soviet player, you win, but you won so early, it's irritating. I think it would be more interesting and I think if I do the count, that will be the fun test to understand this. If the Western allies have more potential victory points that they could get, then I think that actually makes it more interesting, because if either has greater than the other, because if the Soviet player gets everything, right? They get Berlin, they get everything. They get the maximum number of victory points that they can get, whatever that maximum number actually is. But the Western Allied player, let's say they get that early, again, turn 20, turn 21, 22. If the Western Allied player has an ability to draw or exceed that number by getting everything on their side, and they're the side that is less likely to have a weird string of luck and just get everything very quickly, like the Soviet player can, I think that actually might be worthwhile to play, right? Like if you say, hey, if the maximum for the Soviet is, let's just say it's 60. I don't know what the number is, but let's say it's 60. But the maximum for the Western ally is 62, right? Even if the Soviet player gets everything and they get up to 60, then the onus is on the Western Allied player to do even better and get that 62, and thus the Soviet player, who's playing the Western Germans, still has to put up as strong of a fight as they can to keep that from happening. So this seems like a whole lot of chatter for stuff that ultimately may not really matter, but that would really be, I think, very interesting to validate. So what I'll probably need to do is stop my recording, bust out the maps, do the count, record the answer, and talk about it some more before we move on to other games. But I think it's worth a conversation. It might really factor into this value as a game. Now, the nice thing is, if I were to completely say the eastern part of the game is wackadoodle and not worth playing because of those swingy balance issues, I really, really like the western part, the original part, I should say. That is if you buy the Mighty Endeavor, not the expanded edition, just the original edition, that is just the western front. That, to me, is still a very compelling game, even if you're playing the Germans. Like, yeah, you're the Germans, you're on defense, but there's enough counterattack, there's enough interesting decisions, I think, there, that it's still probably a very fun game experience. And obviously, you know, you're not going to be dealing with the wackiness of the East Front. It's a little more constrained, but still a really worthwhile game experience. So, you know, I'm walking away from this feeling really good about the game, but it is worth trying to validate a few things. Now, I'll say for sure that not having played the SCS system probably hurt me in some ways. And this really comes down to, like, this is stuff I should have just known, and this will become more important when I step into the OCS world, like Reluctant Enemies here behind everything else, is that the exploit-capable units on the map, because of their high movement factor, could potentially attack 3 times in a turn. They can do an overrun during regular movement, and if they do sufficiently well enough in that overrun attack to have eliminated or retreated units or whatever, let's see, let me make sure I figure this out. In the initial overrun, they could do well enough to hurt some guys and push them back, right? Then in the standard combat phase, they could do combat and ideally eliminate the units that are nearby them, or something close to that effect. And then in the exploit phase, assuming that they're not in anyone's ZOC, those exploit-capable units could then move and do an overrun attack again, right? So overrun in the regular movement, regular combat, and then overrun in the exploitation phase. 3 times. And that's, I have found that when we look at the combat results table, very generally, I feel it is attacker friendly. Very generally. But only if you're in the 3-to-1, 4-to-1, 5-to-1 range. But even an A1, D1, if you're the Western Allies attacking the Germans, that's still pretty good. Like, I think on a 2-to-1, it's still worth trying. And because the Western Allies have the air point shifts that you can spend air points that you get randomly each turn, you have to roll on a table to get them, you can shift odds a couple columns Like I would have definitely done a lot better if I had been doing those attacks. Doing an overrun, then maybe a big attack with air support for the main combat phase to make sure that I clear the Zocs, and then have overrun combat and do even more damage. I think I would have hurt the Germans a lot more earlier than I ended up doing. And that's a failure on my part, tactically, to understand the combat system. I think I'm constrained or so very used to the games that are like, you move, and then you do combat, and then maybe you get to do an exploit thing, but that's just movement. Having an overrun combat as an option is something I'm not used to, and so I did not use that as effectively. So in my head, I'm like, I definitely, like, I'm okay, I lost, but I had a good time playing this game for 20 hours. I definitely think, like, okay, well, the next time I play it, I'm going to do so much better, because I'm going to play my trucks correctly to the rules, and I'm then going to play better because I'm going to utilize the American and British armor to much more positive effect. And just like any good, like, West Front, Normandy to Germany type of game, like, yeah, I should have encircled more Germans. I should have hurt the Germans a lot more before they got onto the West Wall defensive line. Those are things I didn't do. I mean, I still ended up getting into Germany and taking territory and doing pretty well in the end game. But I would have done even better sooner had I done those things earlier and better and leveraged overrun attacks a lot more than I did. I still did like one or two, but it didn't click for me that, okay, 3 attacks and getting even a D1 3 times, or a D2 if I'm that lucky 3 times in a turn, is so many more step losses than the Germans can sustain that I would have probably been in much better shape. So, I mean, a first time playing a game, especially a big game like this, it's a learning experience. I think I learned a lot. I still had a lot of fun. There's still things to understand about the East Front and how it's balanced against the West Front. Hopefully I'll have an answer to you here in a few seconds on the victory point tally. But in general, I just walked away feeling really good about this game. So, I definitely would say if the game interests you, it's probably worth checking out, or at least trying, and maybe you can play it on Vassal and get a feel for it. But this was definitely, for me, for GameON, the highlight game. This was what it was all about for me, was getting to play this, getting to try it out, learning the system, getting to liberate France, all that kind of stuff. It was very, very fun, very good experience. A smash. It was great. Okay, so I'm going to do a cut here. I'm going to go figure out some victory point stuff, and then we'll come back and we'll start talking about that and then other games. Okay, so I did some calculating. I got the maps out. Quite a lot of stuff going on. You can see some stuff we're going to cover here in a bit. All right, so I had to use some paper to make sure I didn't double count things, and it's a little easier on the East Front to do the victory point counting because many of them are sort of clustered, where the Western Front are just kind of all over the place, and you can easily double count them. So here's a little bit of mathematical analysis for you. And note that when you're playing the combined game, there's some overlap. So some victory points that are here in the Western-only game are basically overwritten, and you're expected to go much deeper into Germany, and so on and so forth, right? Something, if I could get this to line up right, something like that is what actually is what you're playing with when you're playing the combined game. So a couple of things to put in perspective. If you're playing the basic West Front only game, like, this is the edge of the map. Like, you're only fighting, you're doing Normandy way over off camera over here. You're liberating Paris, and then you're getting up into here. And really, you're just trying to get to the Rhine or across the Rhine over here. And if you're up over here, you're doing very well, right? You're pushing the Germans to the edge of the game map, and you get a few more victory points for capturing the very edge. Now, if you're playing the Western-only stuff, it is an Allied victory with 34 victory points or more. If it's 25 to 33, it's a draw, and if it's 24 or less, it's a German victory. And you can actually see the clusters of victory points. I wrote them down here. So there's 9 in all of this sort of, what I did is I organized it by air zone. So this red line, this sort of diamond shape, is worth 9 victory points if you get every single one, including this oddball one way up here. Right, so there's 9. There's 14 up through here, not counting these border hexes. So there's 14 in this cluster around Cologne. And then there's, really, I guess that's Dusseldorf and Essen, this cluster. And then from Cologne southward, again, not counting some of these border ones, there's 14. So if you do reasonably well in getting these clusters, you're going to be somewhere around 30, assuming you get Antwerp, which you're certainly going to want to do that. If you collect up here, like, yeah, you're going to be pretty solidly in the, let's see, 28 plus, let's say 5 of these Netherlands ones. Like, okay, you are solidly in the about to win phase, and then all you really need to do is grab a couple of these ones that are along this border. If you get to the edge of the map in a couple places, you're going to win as the Allies, right? You can almost call the game if you've gotten over the Rhine, you've gotten Dusseldorf and Essen, you've done reasonably well, and you've gotten up to here, like, it's very likely that's probably enough to win as the Allies. You're probably still counting the victory points just to make sure. If you get a total blowout and you're off to the edges of the map, there's about 11 victory points that overlap or get overlapped by the Eastern map. So they're like Strasbourg for 1, these cluster of 3, so that's 4, 5 for Mons, and then 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I think I'm missing one or something. Am I missing one? Let's see, it's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I feel like I actually am missing one or something. Dang it. But the main thing is, like, you're going to end up with enough to win as the Allies, right? If you're just playing the Western Front. And the thing is, the Western Front still goes to April 1945, which I'm reasonably confident is the full 25 turn game. So if you're not playing with the East Front, your threshold of getting, 34 victory points for victory, you still have to do well, but you're probably gonna, as to what's on the map, you don't need everything, but you need most things, right? And that's what you need to win. If you're playing in this opposed game, where these things overlap, let's see if I can get this to overlap as close as I can get it easily without messing with things too much. Then the totals are a little bit different, because you end up with a lot more victory points that are further afield. Some of these ones on the edge are gone, and they're moved further back, right? So here's the count. Here's how it works out. The Western Allies have 82 victory points that they can get that are west of this red dividing line. I'm sorry, the gray-green line that shares hexes with this red line here. So I kind of looked at this as the real border because it's easier to see. So you might not be able to see it here on YouTube, but there's this line that runs like this, splitting the game maps. So the Western Allies can get from basically Belgium, where victory points start to appear, all the way out to here, altogether, drop my pen, 82 victory points. 82. Now, if you're talking about just what's available on this map, I think I had worked it out to be like 47 or 48 victory points. I think I lost one, or I double counted one, or something along this line, and I maybe screwed that up. But just doing that basic calculus, like if you need 34 or more to win, and there's 48, you cannot get a few of them, but you still need most of them. If you're playing the combined game, the onus is much higher because you're competing with the Soviet player. So you need, there's 82 on the board that you can get. Maybe not certain that you will get, but that you can get. The Soviets have, across all of their stuff over here, a total of 77 victory points. So 77 victory points that they can get maximum. So if you have a case of total early game blowout, right? Total early game blowout, the Soviet player will have 77 victory points, whether that's turn 20, turn 21, turn 22. That's the maximum they can get. They can't get any more than that. There's no bonus victory points. That's it. If they get every hex, if they control everything, what will happen, even with unit transfers, because there are cases where the Western German player has to transfer units from the West to the East, even if those units are taken away and the Eastern German player can't place them anywhere because the reinforcement hexes are taken by the Soviets, the Western German player still have to give up those units, I believe. So it doesn't help them as the Soviets. If there are going to be units withdrawn from the Western Front, they're going to be withdrawn no matter what, I believe, even if the Eastern player has taken every place that those units could come in. So if the Soviet player just gets really lucky and does a complete blowout, 77. If the Western allies are sitting there saying, like, I can't win this game, that is not a clear, that doesn't have to be the end of the game at turn 20. It's going to be how good are the Western allies doing. If the Western allies are doing pretty good, and they think they're going to be able to penetrate as deeply into Germany, they can get 82 victory points, which is more. So I see this as a really good thing. If the game is balanced such that both offensive players, both players playing the game against each other, are both really good at offense and suck at defense, let's just say, and the Soviets are lucky or do reasonably well, then the Western Allies, if both max out, the Western Allies win. But the Western Allies don't get the magical, die rolls that are going to hurt the Germans, and they very generally have worse terrain for the most part. I mean, you can say what you will about Slovakia and the areas in what is now Czechia. These mountains, right? Like, that's tough. But then, everywhere else is easy peasy for the most part compared to the craziness that is the West Wall, these rough terrains, these forests that are all together. There's not a lot of maneuvering space once you get to the Rhine, and getting across the Rhine is a nightmare. That, I think, helps. I'm having this realization as I'm recording this, so bear with me. It helps, I think, my concern around the game balance. I think I was worried, or the concern was there that, if the Russians just get to Berlin, the game is over. Might as well call it quits. It doesn't have to be the case. The Western Allies, whether or not the East Front ends early, have the ability to keep pushing to match or exceed those victory points. I think if it was reversed and the Soviet player had more victory points, that would be game-breaking. If it was equal, I think I would still have an issue with that because, again, the Soviets are likely to be able to do better just on the way that the die rolls could go and how easy their job might be, that I think it's balanced and it works well, that the Allies have a little bit of extra feasibility. They just have to go a lot farther to get it. So when you look at Leipzig, this area around Leipzig and Halle are altogether 7 victory points. Even, if you don't get this far as the Allies, maybe you just get to Magdeburg, these in Zwickau, I should say here also, which is why this piece of paper says 9. If you don't get this far, but you get like this far, and you're missing those 9, then you lose, right? Like you have 9 less than your maximum. That's not enough for victory. You still have to push really far, but you have the luxury to keep, even if the Eastern player ends early, that's still a feasible thing. So it still means that even if the Soviet player gets into Berlin and is super victor, awesome, good job, they still have to play well on defense throughout the whole game as the Germans. The game should not be called early unless the Western Allies look in there going, I can't get to Leipzig. I can't get to Nuremberg. If I can't get to central Germany, or this section of the map, if I can't get out this far, I don't think I'm going to be able to do that in the last couple of turns. Then you can probably call the game and say it's a Soviet victory. But if it's feasible, you should keep playing. And to be honest, if you're that late in the game, the Western Germans are probably so shot up that you're going to be able to get guys racing down these roads and nabbing these victory points pretty easily, ideally. I mean, if you're really talking about a true breakout situation. Now, it feels a little unfair because, again, if you're just playing the West game, this is as far as you need to go, and this is all that really matters. And the time frame is the same, right? So if the game only expects you to get to around here in the base game, and you might need to get all the way out here in the full game, that seems a little unfair in some respect. But that's also keeping in mind, like, the Soviet player could have bum luck and not activate very much and only get out to here, right? I mean, if you think about the fact that in Justin and I's game, Justin had, 46 victory points? Well below 77. That's because a lot of these victory points are clustered around here that he didn't get. If he had 46, I might only need to grab, and it'd say that's a regular thing, right? If I put these maps back together, I'd say I get all of this. That's 9. That's 28 there. So 37, and then if I get just down into this area, 37 plus 12, 49, then I win, right? I might not, if he can't get to Berlin, if the die rolls come out to be, maybe we'll say average, and he doesn't get into Berlin or something, you only have to get what the base game expects and a little bit more, whether that's from Hanover and Hamburg, Bremen, or maybe down here in Stuttgart. If you made a major breakthrough in either case, that's probably enough to give an Allied victory. So I am generally feeling pretty good about the balance based on that alone. But ultimately, I still think this is up to another play to solidify my thoughts. So if you can't tell, the fact that I'm talking about this game to the degree that I'm taking a whole almost hour of this video talking about the Mighty Endeavor should indicate something, that it is a game worth the time spent talking about it, certainly worth the time spent playing it. So again, not a real review, but I think this is worth a look, particularly if you're playing games, you don't have something that is this multi-front late stage game thing where you get to liberate France. This is a fun game to do it in. I know there's other games out there like Liberty Roads and a few other ones, but I've had some fun with this one for sure. So, okay, that's going to do it for the Mighty Endeavor part of this video. I hope this was of value. This was interesting. I know a lot of folks were at least interested in me talking about this game. We're going to shift gears a bit and talk about another game here next. Okay, so I know that was a lot of talking about the Mighty Endeavor, but considering it was the highlight of the convention for me, I don't feel so bad about talking about it that much. Someone's going to say, why didn't you make that its own video? And you're probably absolutely right, but you know what? This is just how I'm going to roll, okay? Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is what I guess was really the second... Let me think about this for a second. I guess this would have been my second game at the convention, though it was played in between sessions of the Mighty Endeavor, and it is a game that I do not own, so I just printed off something to use here, Supremacy 2021. So this was a game that a friend of mine had with him at the convention. He was looking to play it. He didn't get enough players signed up before the schedule closed to give it a shot, and so when it was Wednesday and I was kind of just hanging out at the convention, relaxing, hanging out with a buddy, just seeing what was going on, he recruited my buddy, my other buddy and I, into a 3-player game of Supremacy 2021. Now, as I'm saying this, you might be thinking in the back of your head, like, hey, Supremacy, that sounds familiar. Yes, that it may be familiar to you. Supremacy, just called Supremacy, was a game from, I think, back in the 80s, and was sort of, and basically this game is a successor to it, it's like Axis and Allies, but X kind of game, right? It took a really basic framework like Axis and Allies and just kind of did its own thing. And the real, I guess, draw for this game is that you can read the subtitle, The Superpower Game of Nuclear Brinkmanship. So while the game has area movement, and you can think of the scale somewhat similar to maybe the simplest version of Axis and Allies, a single space encompasses a broad region, it is set in a more contemporary time frame and includes the use of nuclear weapons as a way to operate in the game space. Now, I'm not familiar with the original Supremacy, but my understanding is that recently there was Supremacy 2020, which was sort of managed by the original designer of Supremacy, and then Supremacy 2021, which succeeded the next year, which included some additional changes to the rules. How all of this relates back to the original, and I know the original had like expansions and stuff, it's really not clear to me, having not played the other version. So this is the only version we played. It was a somewhat basic, version. We didn't play with, I don't think we played with any optional rules because it was just, a pickup game. So I took over what I assumed was the European Union as my faction, though, and maybe this is a bit of the designer's politics bleeding into the game, the little token for that power was a German flag, or like a German eagle, rather, not a German flag, but the German eagle. I don't know what's the intention with that or what, but there you go. My one buddy played Russia. I suppose you could consider that the Russian Federation, and then the person who had brought the game played China, communist China, current China, whatever you want to look at that. Now, what's interesting with the game as he had brought it was that you have to order it special from the designer or something, or from the website. The playing pieces are a resin mold, and so each faction has a color, and then it's got all of its stuff is in that color, all in a semi-transparent resin material. So land units are all these little tanks. You also have naval ships, but they all look the same. This doesn't have any granularity like an Axis and Allies game where you have different land units or different naval units. It's just land units or armies or whatever, and they're represented by these tanks, and there's fleets that are represented by a ship counter. And then you have a few housekeeping tokens that are used on the game tracks, and then you have a player power token that is drawn at random to determine the play order of certain activities. Now, obviously, those aren't the only units that matter. You also have these very sharp, I was afraid to put my fingertip on the tops of them, sharp missile-shaped resin figures that represent the number of IBM missiles you have, or defensive ABM weaponry. So gosh, watch your kids with these things, and watch out you don't step on them. They were very sharp. But the thing is, the resin, not all the pieces really looked very good. To be honest, I was kind of put off by the resin models in general, just because they didn't all come out in good consistency. And it looked like the production values overall of the game were pretty low. So the resin is nice in theory, but it didn't look like it worked that great. And then the mat was sort of a matte printout, and like the whole game looked like it came in a cylinder. So like the rule book and the map and all the resin pieces and baggies were like in this tube that my buddy got, and that's what you had. Now there are interesting things in this game. So you can kind of see it's really faded, and I'm sorry about that. It's my printer. There's minerals, there's oil, and there's food resources. And I think what's really, I think the strength of the game is that you have a bunch of these cards. Now the cards were fine quality, and what they represented were some amount of these resources, minerals, oil, or food, that were sort of created or manufactured or made available via companies. And these companies resided in countries or spaces on the map. And you sort of gain the benefit of these resources by having the card, but that card could represent a company operating out of another superpower, could be from a totally independent country, but the fact was you had some stake or some control over the company enough that you were getting those resources. Now, it's a really interesting like relationship, because what you would have is the ability to say, well, I'm going to invade. This is just an example. You could invade Iraq and seize the oil card from whoever happened to have the Iraq card, and now you are getting the oil from Iraq. And you could then like leave your, you could take your units out of that country if you wanted to at that point. It's a little simplistic, right? If you use Iraq as an example, you can move your units in, seize control of the oil refinery companies, whatever, then move your units out, have them do other stuff. But so as long as you have the card, you are ostensibly going to get those resources. There's also a global market mechanic where you can sell excess resources. Let's say you have tons and tons of oil. Well, you could sell that oil and get money, and money's actually really important. You want to be flush with cash, because one of the ways you can leave the game is to be bankrupt, or to basically, yeah, I think it's just bankruptcy or something like that, something along those lines. But what can happen is by selling my excess oil, I'm getting rid of oil maybe I don't think that I need, and I'm making a profit. But what that does is that lowers, because I'm putting more supply on the global market by selling it, that decreases the cost for other player powers. So your turn order, when it comes to the economic phase where you're doing this global trade stuff, can be really important. So if I am first to go, I'm going to make a huge profit off my excess oil, and that may mean that the other players can buy whatever oil they need. But if they also had excess oil and I beat them to the punch, they're not going to get as much money as I did because I was first to market. Now, I don't know how, like, is that balanced? Well, it's random every time, so I suppose that's its own balance. But it definitely is this interesting interplay of things, and it eventually gets to the point where, in terms of the game economy, like, between 3 players, and we were playing with a jump start short game, so everybody got more starting companies than you would ordinarily start with. We eventually like had hyperinflation occur, where we were all producing enough that we didn't need to buy as much stuff. We were trying to sell it to get more money, which what eventually happened was like the cost to buy stuff was so low because we had so many resources in the market that it was really hard to get money towards the end of the game. And that was actually a major concern, was whoever could sell off their resources first in the economic turn could get the most money. So you're really dependent on pulling your chit first in that economic phase so that you could sell your abundance of resources to the global market, which you can still get money. It's not just you 3 players. There's sort of this implied global, consumption involved there as well. But basically, whoever had the most money could then afford to build more units and various things. And what heightened the game concern was the somewhat random money investment cost to get nuclear weapons. And so, you can obviously, like, just 2021 is like the version of the game, not necessarily when it's set, because, like, if you're the United States, you should already have a bunch of nuclear weapons, right? But the game kind of has it that every player does not begin play with those IBMs, but you have to research it. You basically have to pick: do you want the offensive nuclear weapons, or do you want nuclear weapon defense systems to shoot down nuclear weapons that other players may fire at you? So there's a certain mix of cards in the deck that allow you to get that capability. So I, as the European Union, was actually the first to get IBMs in our game, and as soon as I could start building them, I started building, one, several, and what's interesting is, like, there are ways for you to invade other superpowers that are not played if you're playing with fewer than 6 people. And so I messed around and invaded some countries and sort of just got a feel for the combat system, which is super simplistic. It's basically like hitting on 5s and 6s on d6s, the tried and true 33% chance to hit anything combat roll. There's some things with, like, shore bombardment support you can get from navies, but the combat system is basically pretty simple. But once I started getting IBMs, that really changed things. And it was then other players were spending a bunch of money to get the defensive systems, which I think are actually much more expensive than the IBMs themselves. So once I started getting the bomb, it was a mad race to chase me in the nuclear arms race. Now, as we were getting through the game, it was basically, we were having to hurry up because I had to get back to the Mighty Endeavor soon. But it got to the point where, like, I tried to nuke, I think it was St. Petersburg, but my buddy who was playing Russia had the defensive technology, and he managed to shoot down my missile, which was fine. And so the EU and Russia were in a war for a little while, and it kind of went back and forth. Meanwhile, China was making use of the fact that me and my buddy were picking on each other, and he was overbuilding and was biding his time. But I had noticed he had not yet managed to get the nuclear missile defense system, and he did get nukes himself, but he had only built one. And so right as we were getting to the end of the game, I'm like, okay, something's got to happen where someone's going to win, right? Or we should try to make something happen. Now, in this game, winning means knocking out every other superpower. That can happen in a couple different ways. You can conventionally conquer their territory, or you nuke all of their cities. So cities are just points on the map within regions, within the areas that exist on the map. If I was doing this on my PC, I might be showing you pictures of the map or something, but there's not many pictures on Board Game Geek, so you'll just have to bear with me. You nuke all their cities. So I was thinking, okay, well, if I can manage to get the money put together and just nuke these other countries into the ground, then I'll win the game. And this sounds very maniacally evil, and I was called the EU tyrant while playing the game, which was funny. So what ended up happening was that I targeted China's cities, and by the time the game ended, I had nuked 3 of the 4 Chinese cities that were on the game map. And what is interesting, and I thought was cool, is that there are these black mushroom cloud resin playing pieces that you put over the cities to denote where things have been nuked. So of the 4 cities, I nuked 3 of them, and then the last Chinese city was actually taken by the Russians. So the person who bought the game and brought the game was knocked out of the game first. And as we were trying to figure out, well, okay, what else was going to happen in the game, we were having to wrap it up. And there was sort of this, like, hypothetical, like, we've kind of got to stop playing now, but how would the rest of the game go? Well, at the time we were resolving it, right, China was out. Russia was nearly bankrupt. They had, due to the hyperinflation and the cost of everything else, he was running low on cash. I still had a pretty good bit of money. And my game plan was to basically build some more IBMs and then nuke Russia and win the game that way. That just seemed like that was going to be the best course of action. And I had the money to do it, and my buddy did not have enough money to build more defensive platforms. So as long as I could get past the 1 or 2 that he had, I would be able to nuke his cities and achieve victory. The counterpoint to me just assuming that I was going to win the game was that apparently in this game, if there's only one city left of a faction and somebody takes it militarily, they just sort of absorb the other faction, including all their company cards that they have and their force pool and a bunch of other things, which felt a little strange, but I guess I can understand it, right? I mean, I guess I'm the villain of the world anyway, so yeah, why not unite the forces that just conquered you militarily to fight the nuclear tyrant? It's all good, and the assumption was that, with the combined might of what was remnant of China, that Russia and China could outperform the EU at that point, but it was kind of up in the air, but we had to stop playing. So I think my big takeaway is, like, this game is fun. It has a lot of really interesting mechanics. We didn't play with any optional rules. The optional rules in the base game would have included things like weather and a couple of other things. I think that would have probably helped vary the game a little bit in terms of the military stuff. But my understanding is that the 2021 version does not incorporate necessarily things that came in expansions for the original Supremacy game. And in general, when we started having rules questions and I started looking at the rules, I was very disappointed to find that, like, the rules are just not that well put together. Now, I realize it's a single guy, but if this game's 30 fucking years old or something, like, I would kind of expect the rules to be pretty darn tight, and they're really not. The language needs to be tightened. There's really a need for an editor or proofreader, maybe even a developer, to come in and help refine some things. But the way that my friend explained it to me is, like, it's just the singular guy. He's doing this thing. You can't get the PDF of the rules available anywhere. You have to have bought the game, and then if you want you obviously get a physical copy, but if you want the PDF, you have to, like, email the guy or something, which makes it very inaccessible if you want to try to take a peek into the game other than tracking down older versions. And the rules are rough, and the components are rough. It's an interesting game, but I don't think I'm going to go out and purchase this unless I'm given word that it's gotten a lot of improvements or enhancements. I would like better rules. I would like it to be a little more accessible for someone outside looking into the game, right? If you try to look stuff up on it, you kind of have some limited options. And maybe I'm missing links, and maybe folks need to point me in the right direction. But I feel like it's lacking in a lot of things. And what I would like to see it is, one, the base game gets fixed up. Maybe we're looking at Supremacy 2022. I don't know. If they're just going to do yearly iterations, that seems a bit oddball to me, but whatever. If the base game can be refined and eventually some expansions come out that can kind of broaden or enhance the gameplay with more options, I think that'd be really cool. I think the base game is cool too, but again, it just needs some tightening around it. So, if in the future I'm at a convention and somebody brings out Supremacy and wants to play, I think I would definitely play it. I don't think I'm willing to spend the money right now on it. Again, just components and rule quality. But, I mean, it's a heck of a fun game when you're talking about, how many nukes are you building, and we got to stop the guy who's building all these damn nukes, and all that kind of stuff is kind of a fun, shtick thing to enjoy. So there you go, guys. Supremacy 2021. It was interesting. It was not in my plan to play, so it was a pickup game. It was fun, but mileage may vary. If you guys have ever played Supremacy or have played one of the newer versions of Supremacy and can help enlighten me or share some interesting tidbits, I would love to hear from you in the comments section down below. All right, let's move on to the next game. Okay, so on Friday, I played Fire in the Sky. This was my morning game. I had scheduled 5 hours. Now, somewhere, maybe it was on Board Game Geek, there was something about it being like the Pacific War and 5 hours or less or something. And I think that might be true if you're really, really good and familiar with the game. I underestimated this one. So I think my opponent and I, neither of us had played the game before. My opponent did have his own copy of the rules. He had to print it out. I think, gosh, I definitely would say if you're getting this game and you've never played it before, my recommendation would be to allot much more time than 5 hours and to play a sample turn or two and then restart and play a real game after those 1 or 2 turns. I ordinarily wouldn't say to do that for most war games because you kind of figure things out as you go. There are things you can do in the first couple of turns of this game that can really screw you up if you don't do things right, or you don't understand the full consequences of your actions with this one. So we ended up playing we really ended up playing 2 turns. We got to the end of that like 2 sample turn setup, and we were getting beyond that. It was, well, maybe we played like 3 turns, but by the time we were at the end of those 3 turns or had played partway through the 4th turn, it was like, okay, we both clearly made a lot of mistakes. I played the US, he played Japan. I think he probably made some really rough decisions that for the long-term game for Japan was going to be rough. But I made similar mistakes. And it was kind of like, oh, okay, now we get how all of this works. It would be really nice to try this again, but we're not going to get any farther, and we've got to, we got to break because he had another game and there was this other stuff going on. We just couldn't keep playing it. Now, I'll say a couple of things. I know that there are some people that do or do not like phalanx games and were upset with the counter art. I'm going to throw this up again so folks can see this. When I say again, I mean I did an unboxing video where you could see some of this stuff. Now, the grief was that this dark color on dark color is really unfortunate and blah, blah, blah. So let me say this. I think that if the counters were what were originally published as the like playtest prototype art, I still think that would have been better. But once you're actually playing the game, like, it really doesn't matter. In fact, like, yeah, I'm not paying too much attention to the silhouette. I'm really paying attention to, is it a DD or a CL or a BB or a carrier or whatever. And it really ends up not mattering. And I know there was a bunch of crying and belly aching about some of these from other people. I didn't think it was a big deal. You can almost see it on this counter here where like the die cut, oh god, I'm not going to be able to get it on here. I'm sorry, guys. The die cut on the counters themselves on the counter sheet left a little like there was something uneven there. I mean, I guarantee if you didn't know that and you just punched your counters and played with it, you would never notice. You would never notice or care. And we didn't. I mean, it had zero effect on play. So there's somebody who did their unboxing. I was a person who really called it out, and I was messing with the hinge, but it was because I had heard that somebody was like really irritated by it. At the end of the day, it truly mattered like 0%. Did not matter at all. Obviously, Japan's a little bit easier to see, but the aesthetics ended up not really mattering to me so much. In general, I think I do prefer this map and the overall map more than the last MMP version, because the MMP version had a bunch of clouds and it just seemed odd. Here, it just being sort of all the same, like gray, navy blue color, maybe is a little off-putting, but it was very clear in play. So from an aesthetic perspective, it worked very well. When I look at, and you can see the example here, is like, oh, it's a lot of gray or navy blue. It is true, but you can see everything else very clearly. It facilitates play well. It was all fine. The battle board was useful. I mean, in general, all the components did what they needed to do, and they did it quite well. The way the game really went, and it's kind of hard to speak to this without trying to like get all the stuff out. Here's the thing. Here's what I think anybody who's not familiar with this game needs to understand to enjoy it and to not make the mistakes that we did. There is a cadence to the actions in this game that reward metering out your units carefully. And what do I mean by that? So, and I would love to demonstrate this on camera in the future, because I do like this game, by the way. I should say that. I really liked it, and I want to do more with this game. But what's really tricky is that the game uses these home base mechanics. So without getting the home map out, just I'm going to show. There's an illustration here where it's these big holding boxes. These are the main ports in Japan. And then you have some holding boxes over here, which are, basically the West Coast and Pearl Harbor. And what will happen is you send your units out, you deploy them, which means they'll go to your different bases and they'll hold there. And then you'll have your actual operations phase, which will send them off on a mission to fight a battle, do the thing, whatever it is. And when they're done, they will return to base. But that base is your holding box, whether that's over here as Japan or over here as America. They go all the way back. Then you have an opportunity to redeploy, which in theory might mean that you can send these guys back out. Now, it's weird because other war games don't really do that. Where, usually it's like, oh, they went and fought this battle, they're going to return to base. Well, they're going to return to base usually from wherever they left it from, or maybe they're going to rebase in the place that was just taken, and now you've got a new base to hang out in. Where you go back to home base, and then you can redeploy. You can redeploy somewhere else. It puts this weird administrative step in between, and if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to screw yourself up very badly, in fact. So the basic way it works is when you're doing a general deployment, meaning you're not actually attacking anybody, you're just preparing for offensives, you spend transport points. The Allies spend transport points, the Japanese spend transport points. Nothing too crazy there. When you do operational movement, like actually going to fight and do stuff, the Allies don't have to spend anything except for transport points for moving land units or air units to their destination, if they're going to do an amphibious invasion, that sort of thing. The Japanese have to spend oil. And so you can imagine oil is a precious resource. You have to kind of meter that out. The tricky thing is, when you do the general deployment, you use transport points. And then when you're done with your operational movement, you have a second deployment action to put the ships back out where you want. Now, what you can do very easily, and if you're not realizing that you're doing it, it is very easy to overspend on transport points in that first deployment stage and then leave yourself with nothing to redeploy after that operation is complete. Which means that, yes, I could take Rabaul from the Japanese, and I did in our game, and then realize that because I moved other stuff around, I really didn't put myself in a very safe position after the operations phase, and it just lets the other player hit you with a big hammer when their turn is up. And so what my opponent and I both did, and this is what's kind of interesting with our mistakes, is we both did this thing where we overspent on transport points, we went and took stuff, or we did what we felt like we needed to do, but then we didn't have anything left over to kind of replenish the defensive position or set up for good reaction movement. And then the other player would go and overspend on transport points and basically do the same thing. And if you go big swings like that, you're going to have really kind of like high impact actions, but it's so swingy in terms of like, okay, we're just pushing each other really far, and I don't think that's the way the game is really intended to be played. We were just sort of doing it that way, and in the process of the Japanese player doing that, he actually really screwed himself up where I'm trying to think of what ended up happening, is like he spent out all his transport points. He didn't have enough to transport oil from the oil areas back home, so he ended up running out of oil, and he basically lost like a turn or two of really good operations because he screwed up the transport points. Now, again, we played it through a few turns, and then we realized our mistakes collectively that we were both making, but the U.S. was in a much better position after the end of that because I didn't have to worry about oil, that it was kind of just like, okay, had we kept playing, it probably would have just been a really bad time for the Japanese anyway, but it was kind of a bum game. Like, we both screwed up. It would be nice to revisit it knowing these things. Now, I think the way that we would have done better and gotten around all of this was to be much more intelligent about the size of our task forces that we were moving in any given move, and had a really clear idea of what the post-battle situation should look like. Now, that sounds like good war game and war planning, war game planning and war planning. But you have to actually be really careful here because, again, you have this metered resource that is really easy to spend really fast. You know, it's burning a hole in your pocket and you can screw yourself up. So if I played again, I would have to warn, if my opponent was new to the game, I would have to warn them and say, listen, don't overspend or you're going to screw yourself big time. You got to be really careful. You need to think about what are you going to take, what are you going to take it with, and how do you know you're going to have enough left over to do all the other things that you need to do. So as the Japanese player, you have to think about what transport points am I spending to get the units where I need them to go to conduct the operation. I need to know that I have enough oil to conduct said operation using as few units as are needed to complete that objective. I need to use transport points to then reposition my units after I'm done taking the objective and still have transport points left over so that I can transport oil at the beginning of the next turn back home so I have more oil to use. Now, when I describe it that way, I mean, that sounds like, okay, yeah, that's part of the game. That's the tough decisions you're making, but you don't necessarily realize you need to take it that seriously until you make a big mistake. And maybe somebody's out there going, oh, come on, Steve, you should have known that's how it worked right away, and it was really clear. Again, for the US, who I was playing, I didn't feel the burn as badly, but boy, Japan sure did. But even the US can still screw up doing that. Like, if I do this, if I send my 8 strength army, which takes 16 transport points on a naval invasion, if I'm going to do that, that heavily decreases my ability to move, a carrier task force all the way from, the West Coast or Honolulu or whatever to that naval base that I just took to provide good reaction capability on the Japanese player's next turn, which is coming up next, right? Like, it's that kind of decision making, and it's good decision making. It's good, like, resource constraint war planning that is cool. It's just, boy, it's gonna go right over your head if you've never played this before and you're gonna screw it up the first time. Then you can re-rack the game, start over again, and have a much better time. We just didn't get to and then we were going to have a better time. But I like the systems in the game. Like, it makes sense. Like, I've played other Pacific War situations and other game systems. I kind of have a good feel for how it should go. I know the major battles and the fronts that matter. And very generally, I would say that the game makes a lot of sense in that way. I can definitely see how the Chinese, Burmese, India CBI theater can get tricky. Now, China is really not included here, but you do have the British fighting in and out of India, Burma, and Southeast Asia. So you have that front. It is very much based on some of the land capabilities and air support, with some naval stuff mattering there, which feels about right. You do have all the stuff going on with the Philippines and basically both the Central Pacific and South Pacific campaigns, and that I could kind of see how those developed, even with the game being these really huge hexes. It all makes a lot of logical sense as to what area can you reach on the map from which base, how far can you go, where do the air zocs matter. It all rang pretty true in terms of what I was expecting, so that was really good. The general processes of how fights are conducted, it is really mostly basic, where you're rolling a d6, you want a 5 or a 6 most of the time, and then there are a few exceptions to that. I do think, like, the surface combat system is interesting, where the armor of the ship matters and the firepower of the ship matters. But there's also some really weird things, like a surface combat group is never, ever, ever going to be able to hurt a carrier group. Now, I know why it's set up that way, which is the planes can kind of tell the carriers to, get the F out if they need to, and the air is always going to have supremacy, so that's fine. I'm used to playing in other games where, yeah, there's still this small chance that a surface group could try to hurt a carrier somehow, some way. I don't know. Again, it still rings true. It's just some things you got to watch out for. You can really screw up by including a land unit with your carrier task force. Like, you don't want to do that. That you will screw up right away. You need to understand, and as a new player you won't, you need to understand that if you're going to do this big operation to take an important place, you need to send a land unit that costs transport points. You need to send the actual surface escort, which will cost won't cost transport points, but it depends on where they're based. But you need surface combat ships to ideally provide shore bombardment ground support. But you also need surface combat ships to maintain sea control after the surface combat, which will occur. And then you probably also would like to have a carrier group so that the air can contest any enemy air and also provide really strong airstrike ground support. So I do like, what I really enjoyed was the process of really thinking through this operation. Like, okay, I'm going to send this 4-strength Marine land unit. I'm going to send the battleships so that I can do some great shore bombardment. I'm going to make, keep a fair number of cruisers or light cruisers available to just at least take sea control. And gosh, he's got a carrier within reaction movement distance. I better send one of my carriers so that I can test his carrier, because there is reaction movement in this game where once you've moved stuff, the opponent does have an opportunity to respond. And so the critical strategic placement of task forces nearby vulnerable places you think your enemy might attack is also important here. So there's all these really hard decisions of, I've only got so many transport points, I've only got so much oil, I'm going to try to get in here, I need to try to put as much force in as I can, and hope to win the battle. And at the end of the day, you're still going to have some die rolls that are tough. For instance, my Japanese opponent did try to take the Dutch East Indies, and my gosh, my Dutch forces in Surabaya managed to survive a turn or two, because I just had really good dice, he had crap dice. So you are going to run into these weird situations where the dice just don't go your way. You could have some ahistorical stuff. The Philippines might hold out a little bit longer if you roll badly. So there's still that opportunity, you're probably going to follow some similarly historical lines in the game, but there can still be some surprises that can occur. So I don't want to go too much longer on just this game, but I will say this much, that, again, the first couple of turns, the turns that we played, period, were learning for sure. I had to peel back a lot of these layers and really understand the do's and the don'ts. Having come out of that, I am really looking forward to being able to play this game against someone. I could do it solitaire too, but I think I would prefer to play it opposed, so you get a little bit more of that, I don't know, just a little more engaging because of the decisions you have to make. But I would really like to play this again, and I think I'm going to have a blast with it. I did genuinely like it. I like the systems. I think they made sense for all the different modifiers. The charts are pretty straightforward. So the trick is not how am I implementing the mechanics of the game in terms of following the procedures. It's more about just getting an understanding of how those things play out on the board and avoid the pitfalls that are kind of maybe too easy to fall into. But I think with just those couple of caveats that you can explain to someone, this is going to be a lot of fun, for sure. So would really like to play more of it. Looking forward to my chance to do so. I did have a fun time with Fire in the Sky. So that's 2 games now by Tetsuya Nakamura that I've quite enjoyed. The other being the Crisis of Frederick II, or whatever that game is that I've done some videos on. So yeah, there you go. This was good. Okay, so then on Friday afternoon, when I was done playing Fire in the Sky, I was set to help playtest a game that is in development in the Levy Campaign series. So I'm going to put a game on camera here This was not the game that I played, but I wanted to talk to something. So this is Nevsky, Teutons and Rus in Collision, 1200s, Vokorunke, part of the Levy and Campaign series. This is volume 1. This is the only one that I have at the moment. A lot of people hate this game art for some reason. I think the box art's fine. So I played this game that's in development. And this is one that Justin is developing. Again, I mentioned Justigar. Justin, great guy. He's working on a game. He's putting a lot of hard work into it. He's done a ton of research. It's coming together. And for me, that was really my first time playing this Levy and Campaign series. I've not played Nevsky proper. I've read through the materials. I've looked at it. But me learning to play the game was via playtesting this new game in development. So I want to keep the game in development details obfuscated because it's really not my place to talk about that. But what I want to focus on is my opinion of the Levy and Campaign series just based on the mechanics, knowing that this is how it works in other games. Now, there were certainly game-specific rules for this new game that I need to call out, are not in Nevsky or not in the rest of the series, and I need to just kind of leave that part out of my conversation here. But I have to say, right now, I'm feeling a little uncertain about the series. So this is one that I was definitely looking forward to trying, because an operational medieval game is super cool. You get to take a look at all these conflicts that maybe haven't gotten a lot of attention, like Nevsky, like Inferno that's in development, and others that are coming, Almoravid, all these really interesting things. And generally, the art, the production value of these games are all pretty neat. I think, well, a couple of things. One is, while I was playing and playtesting, I received news that a friend and colleague of mine had passed away, and that probably put a very negative effect on me for the rest of that day and through the rest of the weekend. And I would like to think it doesn't color my opinion, but it's just one of those things, I was probably in a worse mood then as I continued to play and trying to learn the system than maybe I otherwise would have. So, I mean, and I can't knock, this background book. Isn't that, look at all this cool stuff they talk about. It's fantastic. But I think where I get tripped up with this system, because I haven't even punched a lot of these things, is some of the bean counting nature of the game. So here you can see there's these counters for boats, for sleds, for provender, which is the food that you feed your troops. There's this, really concentrated system all around resources, money, loot, the food. There's these counters for units, a couple other things, though the counters for units are optional. You have these different counters that represent units, and units belong to leaders. And you have this kind of stuff. Now, there's a lot of information here for this. And where it was my nerves are raw at the time, so the things that might annoy me even more. So look at this. So Norse units, there are 4 different kinds. They range from, I'm sorry, this is not Norse, horse. My gosh, kick me in the butt, guys. Horse and foot. Okay, horse and foot. Two different major types. And then you have 4 horse types. You have knights, which are the silver triangular prism. There are sergeants. There are light horse. There are Asiatic horse. For foot, there are men-at-arms. There are militia. There are serfs. Knights inflict, I think it's 2 melee hits. Sergeants do 1 melee hit. Light horse do half a ranged hit and half a melee hit. So on, so forth. Now, this is just part of the game that, some people like little wooden objects that you can pick up and move around. I hate those things. I don't like wooden pieces. I tolerate them. I tolerate them in coin games, but it's okay, if there's a lot of information I need to parse here, and you've given me a nice chart to look it up, That's fine. I would prefer a counter that just says this stuff. Now, lucky for me, they did provide those things, right? They provided these counters for Nevsky. Now, my understanding is they are stopping doing that because apparently some GMT data indicates that those counters are not used, that people prefer the wooden blocks. But I guess I'm just unlike these other people. Of course, I haven't really played this game, so my vote probably shouldn't count. They have these icons for strongholds that indicate inherent garrison values, and you can do all these different things. So in general, like, the combat system is fine. It's fine. I don't like it that much. I don't think it feels odd. It's a bit unlike other game systems, and that's okay. I'm not sure that I particularly like it, but I think where the game really, the system, I should say, not the game, the system, where things trip me up are these actions. So march, okay, you move, not a big deal. You can siege, you can storm, so that's not too crazy. You can do a supply action, where you can get more provender to feed your troops. You can do forage if you don't have a clear supply line. And then you can do a couple of these other things. Ravage, you can screw up somebody's territory and get some food. You can tax if your guys are near their home and get some money. That's all cool, right? These are all actions that don't seem terribly complicated, and I guess it's not complication that is what gets me. It's the tedium that gets me. So when you have your player cards, there's a couple of things that you're managing. Like, one, you're playing through the turns and you're adjusting your army availability. Okay. That's all fine and dandy. But what you end up with are these little charts. I'm just going to show this at a very high level. So here's the Prince of Novgorod, right, from this base game. You've got this little section down here where you can say how much transport do you have, whether or not you're able to get access to these other vassal placards, which will give you more units to have on your guy to do stuff. And you've got a few other values here that govern how many actions they can take. And stuff's not really like, none of it's bad, but it gets tedious when, for the actions that you want to take for your turn, you are fighting through the fact that, most actions that you would take militarily are going to cost food. You can see there's going to be somewhere on here. Maybe it doesn't say it on here exactly. You've got to spend food or loot when you're done marching. So, and this is like the hallmark of the game, you are needing to get supplies, put the provender marker on your thing, take your action. Okay, you did a thing, spend the provender that you just got, and then you're done. It gets to this, like, I call it the +1, -1 crap. If you're taking an action that gives you something, and then you're just immediately going to spend the thing, can you skip that part, right? And in theory, you can. You can say, okay, well, I'm going to supply, I get my provender, and then I'm going to spend it again as one of my 3 actions or whatever, and, like, that's it. And I can get where folks can really enjoy that, but I don't know. Again, I'm put off a little bit. It was a bad day for me that day, but it was definitely this annoying thing, like, okay, I did the thing, and now I'm going to spend this thing. Okay, and now this guy gets to go again, but I know I'm going to move, or I'm going to move later, so I'm just going to do nothing and get food, and then I'm going to move. And then I'm going to do the same thing over and over and over again, and hope that I'm managing to make a actual difference on the game map at all. And I'm spending most of my actions just trying to take the one action that can be taken. Now, the reality is, like, that's all true to the time period, but you can kind of, like, mechanic that stuff out, right? Like, there, Voco wrote a whole article in C3I magazine about the different supply systems. And for this series, they decided to take a very meticulous angle on it, that you have to have the carts and you have to have the food, and then you got to spend the food, and then you have loot, and loot affects your movement in a certain way, and you got to have carts for all these different things. And by the way, when you reach the end of a season, you have wastage where you're going to lose some of the food and some of the carts that you just had. So at the beginning of the whole new season, you got to you spend your first couple of actions just building more carts and getting more food. Like, okay, guys, you can rule that stuff out, right? Like that, you can speed up the play by saying, like, if given X, you're just going to get these things. Like, if you're going to tax the player economy, the player action economy, on doing these things that everyone's going to need to do anyway, change the rules so that the players don't have to do that, and they can just take the actual actions that matter. Now, I realize there are times in this game where you could say, hey, in this system, again, I gotta be careful because I have Nevsky, but I played a different game that is not exactly like Nevsky, but uses the same basic system. You could say, well, I'm not going to get food this time. I'm going to take a risk, and I'm going to go do this thing, expecting that I'm going to take this stronghold, get loot, and then give the money to my troops so they can go get their own food. Okay, that's a fair, like, yes, that is where some of the gameplay comes in, where you're making these decisions. It felt like when I was playing that I'm more worried about that than really doing anything else, and it wasn't as fun for me in that instance. Now, I'll say I probably need to play a game in this series, whether it's Nevsky or otherwise, again, before I can continue to feel like it's not for me. I don't know. I think I should play Nevsky because I own it. I've already spent the money for it, and I should just give it a go, and then let that help me make the decision, am I going to play this series any longer? I feel like I'll probably end up buying Justin's game because Justin's a friend and a good game player, and he was nice enough to teach me how to play the game series and let me help play test when I signed up for it on the game schedule. So at the very least, I'll probably end up buying his game. But whether or not I really stick with this, it's going to be tricky. Now, there's other game mechanics here I didn't have, like event cards and abilities that can be given to leaders, so you can kind of, there's some replayability about which event cards you're going to get early or late, and arrange your units and improve your leader capability to do these other things. There are ways potentially to screw up your opponent's leader availability schedule, where rightly whole forces on the map can go away because they're done fighting and they're not coming back, and they just go away. That's accurate to the time period. That needs to be a game mechanic. But apparently it can be so dramatic that somebody can lose the entire game because the wrong set of cards could, in theory, be played in a certain way, and if they didn't account for it, they might not have paid their troops enough to have kept them on the board. So you could have these really big swings in how the game runs that way. And it's probably true to history. It's just you got to wrap your head around it. So there are things I like about the system. There are things that, to me, really feel like should have been handled a different way. Now, that would make it much more like other war games, and the whole point of this is it's different. It's got its own way of handling things. Different isn't necessarily better. It's just different, and that will, whether or not it's for somebody or not, I guess will come down to it. I would certainly say the system's worth trying. You might try it and go, oh, this is fantastic, I really like it. Or it might hit you lopsided, like it has so far for me, and it needs some additional thought processes on it. I don't know. So big thanks to Justin for letting me play his game and just experiencing it. Unfortunately, I did drop from the play testing early due to my emotional state, and I had to take time away from it. So it's all very preliminary ultimately, but so it goes. Yeah. So there you go. we'll move on to the next game. Okay, so on Saturday, I got to play a couple different games. The first of which was one that I had put on the schedule that nobody really ultimately signed up for because I put it on really late, like right before they shut it down. But my buddy, who I hang out with a lot at these conventions, had the free time, wanted to play something, so we decided to go ahead and play Silver Bayonet. Now, I've said it plenty of times. This is a great game. You should get it. I will just say it. It is a great game. You should get it. And what we decided to play was this Scenario 4, Into the Valley, LZ X-Ray. Kind of read the blurb there. It is a 4-turn sort of learning mini scenario. And I played the Free World Allies. My buddy played the Communists. And basically, you can kind of see the structure of the game. You get victory points for eliminating enemy steps and occupying LZ X-Ray, which is so marked here on the game map. But, we had a counter there for it. There's also LZ Victor. And basically, the way it sets up is there's a few U.S. units around here and at LZ Victor. And then the communists are kind of coming down through this jungle mountain terrain, mountainous jungle terrain, and trying to take LZ X-Ray. And because I already knew the system, I needed to refresh myself a little bit. I was able to teach my buddy who had never played it, and this was a little bit more hex encounter war game than he's used to. But it was a pretty good run through. We managed to play through within a few hours. I had to kind of talk a lot through the way the different systems worked. But fortunately, we weren't using a huge amount of the rules. It was really straightforward. So the U.S. gets a certain number of air points every turn that they can spend for offensive bombardment or offensive bombardment, defensive bombardment, or ground support type of actions. So they start with just a couple of companies and some artillery over in LZ Victor. And then over several turns, more units are dropped into LZ Victor or X-Ray over the course of the game. And then, some of these guys, you can move them through the light jungle over to LZ X-Ray as the US. If you're the communists, then what you start with are a number of these different companies, some of which are accompanied by mortars, and you do get some reinforcements over the couple of turns, including some relatively weak VC units. And what you have the advantage of is you can kind of come down through this terrain and do your attacks. And your mortars are pretty safe back here that they can fire down into LZ X-Ray, where, for the most part, unless you come a little too far forward, the American artillery at LZ Victor have a hard time reaching and even doing much damage to those mortars in kind of counter-fire situations. But it was pretty fun. What I ended up doing, I won the scenario by a point, and it's because I had, a couple of my companies fighting in the mountainous jungle, which has a lot of defensive benefits. So as the communists try to force their way through, we held this hex for quite a long while. We did eventually get pushed back into LZ X-Ray, but just due to the reinforcements and in good defensive posture, I managed to hold out, and the step losses for both sides were relatively even, but I just managed to get more victory points for holding LZ X-Ray and keeping him from getting the big chunk of points for taking it himself. I think the one mistake, and I didn't realize it until it was over, was and I posted some of these pictures to the YouTube feed in the posts. You can look at the community tab for that. I think the mistake he made was that in the final attack action, I think he chose to do assaults, but he probably should have done maneuver combat instead. And let me see for a second. Moves 9 steps and retreats 1 hex. Yeah, he really probably should have done maneuver combat. And I didn't realize you can't get a retreat result on the assault table, I don't think. Yeah. So he was thinking assault combat was going to be enough to remove enough steps or to force me out, but you can only force the defender to retreat via maneuver combat, I'm pretty sure. And he decided to do all assaulting, and that was probably not the right pick. So very likely he probably should have won, but there were some bits that I forgot about, and if I had remembered, I would have educated him and said, "Oh no, you probably want to just force me to retreat, and then you'll get the LZ, and then you will have won." So it was really a learning opportunity, but it was a fun time, and we weren't dealing with too much of crazy rules. You can just see, just as an example of like, this is the basic player aid sheet with the combat charts. So you can see there's, if you're playing a larger scenario, you get your air points, you get different things. There's air defense fire, and I need to think about this for a second. There's probably a good chance that we forgot to do air defense fire now that I think about it, but I'm not going to worry about that too much. So you can actually have different types of combat in this game. So you can have maneuver combat, which is your typical combat odds calculation. There are a number of modifiers that matter on your efficiency ratings. So units have efficiency ratings. You compare those. If your opponent has more, then that shifts on the combat chart. There's attacker coordination, which depends on efficiency. And then there's a number of different things. Are units fatigued, which are results that can come from combat or artillery mortar fire. A couple other modifiers, and then you get some result that is defender loses so many steps and gets fatigued and needs to retreat, or the attacker retreats, or those number of things. But you also have assault combat, which is purely firepower based or combat strength based, where you're adding up your factors and then you're just rolling a die to see how much damage you do. And so assault combat can be useful in certain contexts, but can be very deadly for both sides, especially because the defender, I believe, fires first. You can also do combat refusal, which is like retreating before combat. You got your attack coordination. This is how you do your ground support and bombardment. So there's several different things you can do. Offensive bombardment is like outside of combat, before combat, you just fire on some units. And it's more likely you're going to fatigue them than actually do a lot of damage, but that's what you want, is maybe to fatigue them. Defensive bombardment is when you fire at the attacker before assault, which can be very helpful. And then there's like maneuver combat, which depending on how you roll, just turn into to column shifts. Or I'm sorry, die roll modifiers, not column shifts. So if you have bombardment, either in the form of artillery, mortar, or for the free rolled allies, air power, you're going to spend those points or have a different amount of bombardment strength that will then give you different results. These results are sometimes modified by terrain, so it's much harder to effectively bombard someone in, say, mountain jungle terrain. But you have these decisions to make about how you're going to use your bombarding units, whether or not you're going to do maneuver combat and or assault combat. And what's really interesting and what plays into the uncertainty of the game is you can say, firstly, you want to, this is like some of the operational technique of the game, you can keep a unit from doing their avoid combat retreat by having units do both, having some units do maneuver combat and some units do assault combat on the same hex. So this is a complex maneuver. You're doing, I probably shouldn't use the word maneuver. This is a complex operation. So you're having some guys, circle around or whatever and do maneuver combat. Some are planning to just assault the enemy position. The maneuvering guys are ensuring that they're pinning the enemy so that the assault can be effective. It all sounds great, but you do have that attack coordination die roll. So the attacker has to roll a die and figure out how coordinated are you. If you roll badly compared to your, if you roll well against your efficiency rating, then your attack goes off and it's fine. It all happens as you intended. If you roll equal to your efficiency rating, then you can't do bombardment support for your combat, which is not terrible, but could be better. But if you roll over your efficiency rating, if you do it just by a little bit, I might also show you the table because that's really what tells you what happens. If you roll slightly above it by 1, then it's uncoordinated. You don't get your attacker support from your mortars or whatever. The maneuver attacks have 1 shift column to the left, and for any assaults, the assault is going to be more deadly for the attacker in general. They're going to roll worse. A +1 is worse in this game system, and the defender is going to roll better. So you don't like that. If you roll really bad, no attack support allowed. The maneuver combat is canceled. Any units designated for maneuver combat now aren't going to attack at all. And the defender gets to pick 1 stack, 1 hex that's attacking, to do an assault just by themselves. And when that happens, they're going to roll worse and the defender's going to roll better. That is huge. That is huge. It's part of the unexpected nature of the combat system. And in fact, what contributed to my buddy's hard time is he rolled well on his attack coordinations early in the first couple turns, but in the last turn, he failed coordination rolls. And it meant that instead of a whole bunch of guys attacking in the final assault, he ended up, I was able to pick 1 stack and they weren't able to do enough damage to force me out. So I guess, now that I think about it, even if he had designated maneuver combat for that one, and he rolled that failure, the maneuver combats wouldn't even have occurred. There would have been some snafu of command, and I still probably would have won. But anyway, that's the cool part of Silver Bayonet, is that you have these different things. You can say, I'm going to try to pull off this really complex operation, but there's risk involved with that as opposed to something maybe more small scale. You have a finite number of ordnance to leverage in the actions that you're conducting. And then one aspect which we didn't get to experience because we weren't playing a prolonged campaign, but this terrain matters more than just combat. It matters for detecting the enemy. So ordinarily you have these hidden unit markers that correspond to a holding box that's hidden from your opponent's view, and they're moving through this terrain, and the allied player, or the free world allied player, has to be like, okay, well, if this hex is, if that hidden unit marker is in dense jungle, then it is more difficult to observe and identify if there are any enemies there than if we were talking about light jungle or some kind of clear terrain. And so there's this whole, it all comes together really nice. I really like it. I'll gush about it. Where you're taking actions to patrol or use observation helicopters to scout out the area, to try to find the enemy. Maybe you succeed and you can nail them then with some stronger air power bombing. Or you fail and you have no idea if there's something dangerous out there about to ambush your units. When you're actually in some hot combat, you can be trying to air deploy units via helicopter into the area, but there are hot LZs, so there's a chance that those guys will be fatigued when they come and land because they've taken too much pot shot fire and stuff like that. I mean, there's all these interesting mechanics, and while the rulebook might seem very big, the reality is the major rules for the game end around page 27. So you're really talking about like 25 pages of rules that govern a lot of different things. You can kind of see what's covered here. You can always check the PDF online. There's movement, there's zones of control, the attack coordination we talked about, the different kinds of combat, bombardment, air power. There are special units that have special things. And then you start getting into some of the campaign rules where, I mean, if you're just playing the shorter scenarios, that's 16 pages of rules or 19 pages of rules. But if you're playing the more protracted thing, then yeah, there's some more stuff to learn and understand. The one strength of the game, which I don't want to leave this video without pointing this out as soon as I can find it. They have two different sequences of play. There's the standard sequence of play, which is just governing the scenarios, which is what we used when we played the scenario. If you're playing a campaign game, there's obviously this more detailed one that covers all the other things that you're worried about in the campaign game. But on the backs of both of these is the crib notes. And I have to say, this is one of the best player aids just for a game in terms of trying to communicate important information that may come up. So it's like, oh, I have a special unit. It's the Delta Force unit. Well, what is this? What does it do? It can do all these things. Very easy to read, very easy to find. This goes for a lot of different game mechanics. Replacements. What is fatigue and what does it do? If they're fatigued, they can't attack, blah, blah, blah. What can mortars do? What do leaders do? There are leader counters. How does bombardment work? All these things are very clearly explained in bulleted format on this sheet. Super valuable to have. So if you're playing the campaign game, you can take your standard sequence of play and just have it flipped over for reference for everybody. It works really well. Very, very useful. It's like what made this game so great when I first got it was, yeah, there's a lot of nuance to the rules and understanding things, but this 25th anniversary edition just manages to make such an amazing, awesome package that actually playing the game just is that much better for it. So I'll stop gushing about this, but it went well. My buddy said he's going to try to buy this because he did have a good time with it. Would really like to play a longer campaign with him because he's a lot of fun to play games with, but because it'd be great to actually play a true campaign with this one. I've played some of the shorter campaigns, but usually not enough time to really play it all the way through at a convention, but fantastic time with this one, guys. Okay, so moving on to what I did with the rest of my Saturday after Silver Bayonet. So it kind of had some open time and didn't really have anything dedicated. I hadn't signed up for much for Saturday. So my buddy and I, when we finished playing Silver Bayonet, we're kind of thinking, okay, well, what do we do now? And we had a guy sitting there with a game that he brought that he similarly came late to the game event scheduling and didn't know what, didn't have anybody signed up. We could tell that he was kind of like bummed. He wanted to play this game, and I looked at it as a fantastic opportunity to play this game that I wanted to, and I had never played before, and we gave it a go. What game am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about Twilight Imperium, this being 4th edition. Twilight Imperium. Pax Magnifica Bellum Gloriosum. This is a very large box, kind of a heavy box too, because it's filled with cardboard and plastic. So this is my copy of Twilight Imperium. That is unplayed. It is opened and unplayed, and that really is mostly because if you're not familiar with this game, it is a big honking game that can be very intimidating to people. And so my wife had gotten this for me for Christmas a few years ago with the intent that, like, yes, I'm going to get some people together someday. We're going to learn to play this thing. And it's a big monster of a thing, right? I mean, that's just the reality of it all. But this guy had brought it. He wanted to play with the expansion because the expansion had come out and he wanted to do that. But we ended up getting like one more person to join it. So it was going to be a 4-player game, not a 6-player game, which is, I think, without the other expansions, I think it's maximum of 6 players. We had 4 people, and none of us had played before except this guy who had brought it and was running it. So we decided to nix the expansion and just play the base game, which is all I have for the moment, and give it a go. And he would teach us. So this guy, very nice guy, had brought his stuff and had organized it all up. We set up the 4-player game, and we played it. We started, gosh, it must have been close to like 5 or 6 is when we started. and we stopped at 4 a.m. Sunday morning. Maybe it was more like 3:30 a.m. Sunday morning. But yeah, once we started going, it is a long game. It's notoriously a long game, particularly for new players. And we ended up getting delayed a little bit by a really long dinner break, which added to the length of the game, and a lot of esoteric discussion about what players should be doing. And I'll get to that here shortly. So let me say, I had a blast. It was very close to being my highlight of the convention, but the Mighty Endeavor won out because it's a war game. This is sort of a war game. It's sort of not a war game. There's war elements. You get to push a lot of plastic spaceships around and go pew pew, blast blast, and that's a lot of fun. But there's also politicking, diplomacy, soft skill usage in terms of negotiation with people and directing the ire of other players at others so that you can win the game and get victory points. It is a much broader game than just war, and it is very cool. It's absolutely a cool game if you're not familiar with it, and I'm sure there's going to be folks watching this that are like, nah, it's not a historical war game, I don't care. This game is a lot of fun. But it's a lot to take in, and I think it's very intimidating to people. It doesn't need to be. It's probably intimidating for the length, but the mechanics aren't that bad. I will say, as we were sitting and learning and exploring, a buddy of mine, a different friend who I play games with at these conventions, stopped by and was like, hey, how's it going? You learning it? You liking it? And he had played a bunch, and I said, well, it seems like there's a lot to it. And he said, well, you've played much more complex games than Twilight Imperium. And this is a guy I've played Here I Stand With, Virgin Queen. He knows that I've played a lot of stuff, and heck yeah, I play World in Flames. This is not as complicated as those games. It can feel that way because there's a lot of different components and a lot of different terminology that, yeah, you have to understand to play the game. It's really not so bad. And I found that by the time we were done, it was like, oh, I can teach this to people. And I did pull up the rule book, the Learn to Play Rules PDF on my phone as we played, because we were passing the rule book around, but it was much easier just to read my phone. And it was like, oh, no, this isn't complicated. This isn't so bad. I understand how this works. It's fine. And it ended up just being a really cool game experience. I mean, it's a sci-fi space opera thing. You move your plastic pieces and cardboard pieces from your home planet to other planets. You conquer them. You use their resources to build stuff or influence things. There's different ways to get victory points. Some of them are not military-based. There's science, research, and like technology enhancements you can get that are just, they give you special abilities or more abilities, or they make your units better. I mean, there's a lot of cool things to this game. And I'll sort of open this up a little bit to talk through some of that stuff. The reality is that, yeah, there is certainly a boatload of stuff. You get a lore compendium with this game, right? There's lore. I've read this. It's been a while since I've read this. It's got a bunch of cool art, really cool art. This is more than just a game. It's like you're getting the experience. Oh yeah, it's been a while since I've had this. Probably some humidity. Oh no! Oh no! Oh no! No no! That sucks. Oh, that's a bummer to see happen here. Oh. Well, that's annoying. I'm not sure why one of these things was sticky, but it was, and so there was a sacrifice. Rules reference. Learn to play. Ugh, that's so frustrating. Why did that happen? But there's tons of components in here, right? There's so much stuff. There's so much stuff. There's cardboard stuff, hexes with planets. There's so much stuff. There's plastic bags of stuff, different ships, all different types. The easiest way that I can try to make sense of this to someone who's not familiar with it, and everything fits in here really nice, but there's other storage options, is to look at a player faction card. Because I think this really helps explain the game even better, to make you understand what kind of stuff we're talking about. There's a whole stack of different science fiction factions that are in here. The Federation of Soul being humans, are in here as well. So this is the Lizix MindNet. They're sort of weird techno-aliens, and they have the ability to assimilate. When you gain control of a planet, replace each planetary defense system, is what PDS stands for, or something like that, and space dock that's on that planet with a matching unit from your own, and you can do some other things. These guys have special abilities. They get a certain amount of commodities that can be traded, and then they've got all their standard units. So everyone has the potential to build all of these units, and they have different values. They have a cost, they have a combat ability, movement, capacity for holding fighters or infantry to transport things. But what you can do is you can get upgrades. So it says Destroyer 1 here. Well, you can upgrade to Destroyer 2, Fighter 2. They all start getting better abilities. Each of these factions gets their own special technologies that are specific to them, that allow them to further have special abilities that are beyond what other people can research and get technology. There's so much to this game that I can't really even scratch the surface of it quickly in this video, but I mean, that's a lot of it. There's different actions you can take. You activate and move ships around. All kinds of interesting combinations of things can happen that it's hard for me to explain this far away from an actual game, but you can set up, you can have your planetary defense systems get range and hit other hexes and blow your opponent's ships from afar even. You can have big, massive space battles. You can have ground assaults. And that's just the base game. There's all kinds of neat things that you can do. And how our game went, which was pretty cool. I have, my faction was the Federation of Soul. That's humans. My special thing is I can spend a token and get free infantry units on a planet that I control. One of the central parts of this game is a planet called Mechatol Rex, which if you take control of it and you're able to take certain actions on a turn, you get victory points. So it's always very dangerous. Whoever decides to take this special planet becomes a target. I, kind of knowing that, because I had seen people play Twilight Imperium before, and I had read about it, and I had sort of read more once I had my own copy of the game, I said, well, okay, I'm going to go take Mechatol Rex. So I figured out a way for me to do it, and I figured out a way that I could get like 4 victory points all within like a turn, and I jumped out ahead of everybody, which made me a big target. So over the course of the game, I was beaten back. I never got kicked out of Mechatol Rex, but there are things that players can do to basically keep me from getting victory points easily for having Mechatol Rex. The only cost is they have to spend actions keeping me from getting victory points than doing other things. I managed to go the entire game up till 3:30 in the morning, never having lost Mechatol Rex, and I was on the verge of winning, and I had the smallest fleet of anybody. I controlled the fewest planets. But because I focused on doing not just military things, but the things that the victory point cards needed me to do, like researching certain technologies or having enough resources or influence to buy certain things, I was still either ahead in victory points or leading the pack all the way through basically the end of the game, up until the very last turn. And I lost almost due to pure dumb luck, because there was something that came up, and I won't go too far into the details, that I was set up to basically be in a win condition within the first few minutes of the final turn that we were playing. I mean, the game could have gone on, but we knew that was going to be the final turn because somebody was going to win. We had all gotten to 8 or 9 victory points, and you need 10 to win. I had set myself up that I was going to win. Again, I had the smallest fleet. I controlled the fewest planets. But I was competitive enough and doing my particular strategy that nobody was going to kick me out of Mechatol Rex. I was going to get victory points. I was going to get the last victory point I needed. And there was a card that came up in a particular deck of the many cards that are in this game that meant that the ability for me to get that last victory point, that action that I would take, went to somebody else, and they managed to get the victory point before I could. And of course, it was my buddy who I'd been playing games with all day. So he and I, we were, I was fine with him winning. I felt like it was fun because everybody was close to winning, and they were all winning in different ways. I had my really sort of fragile but weird way to win, and I didn't even control much of like the galaxy map. There were others who had, huge fleets and were doing different things that they were also getting victory points. But this whole game experience really brought to light something that is kind of interesting. It's this weird quirk. So the guy who was teaching it was very intent on teaching it a certain way and trying to explain the game rules to us. And he's a really nice guy, and I thank him a lot for teaching. I look forward to playing with him again. So this is not a knock against him, but I think there's a challenge when you're trying to teach people a big game and understanding your audience and understanding that if you're talking down to someone or you're trying to explain and tell them how to play the game, like teaching them how to play is different than telling them how to play, if that makes sense. And we kind of had this interesting thing where my buddy, we're buying each other beer and we're playing the game, we're having fun. I know my buddy. I know him pretty darn well. I know how he plays games. I know how he learns games. And I know that he's really good at getting people to not suspect that he's going to win the game. Because he's still feeling out the game, and he's learning the rules, and he's learning what's what, and he's unassuming, and then he comes out of nowhere and wins the game. I know him that way. I know that he's capable of doing that no matter the circumstances. The guy teaching us the game did not realize that, even as I tried to explain to him while we were on break that was how I saw this maybe going. So he was teaching us the game, but he was very careful to point out, like when I was winning and I had come far ahead in victory points, that I was a problem, and the table all needed to focus on stopping me from winning. And that's a valid thing to say, right? Like, yes, that is it. It does require the rest of the table to do things in a certain way to limit my volatility in getting all those juicy victory points. Now, when my buddy didn't try as hard as the rest of the table to stop me, the guy teaching the game saw that as, dude, you're not understanding what I'm saying. You don't understand how to play this game right. You're not understanding the mechanics properly, or you're not understanding what this means. Now, some of the time, oops, didn't mean to hit the camera, but all good. Sometimes it was truly like, oh, this is how that works, and this might be better to do it a certain way. Other times it was, trying to tell my buddy, like, listen, this is the action you really ought to take to stop Steve, right? That's basically the kind of talk that was happening. And, some people react well to that, and my buddy did react well. He's like, well, okay, but I'm going to do this right now because I'm still figuring all this stuff out. And the reality was, like, this is power politics in a game like that, like power diplomacy, where my buddy knew he could probably try harder to stop me, but by not doing that, he put the pressure on the other two players to stop me while he pursued his own agenda to win the game. And he ultimately did win the game, but there were a lot of weird things like, the guy teaching the game was trying to say, well, why don't you get these victory points right now? Because this is what you should do. And my buddy was already thinking 2 steps ahead. So, like, you basically, like, fulfill requirements and then turn them in for a victory point. My buddy was already thinking a few steps ahead and saying, well, I can trigger this victory point whenever I want. I'm going to hold on to it. In his head, he's thinking this, right? And we talked afterwards, and, we all knew, I knew what was going on, but the guy teaching the game didn't really get it. That he had already caught on and said, well, I'm just going to get some of these points because I don't know that I'm going to have them later. I'm going to get these ones now. I'm going to save. I'm going to hold on to this because I can just get this anytime I want. And I'm not going to make myself a target and leap out ahead of Steve. I'm going to let Steve be the problem, and then I'll get these victory points later, which is ultimately what he did. And I kind of knew that it was coming, but, I didn't want to give up the ghost, and I was willing to just play through the game. But the other weird thing the guy teaching the game was doing was he was using too much, like, shark lingo when it comes to this. Now, Twilight Imperium has been around for a long time, and this guy, like, is so into Twilight Imperium, which is great, that he talked about, like, he listens to a podcast, which, amusingly, in the week since we've played Twilight Imperium, both my buddy and I have individually, separately, not talking about it, went and listened to the podcast to learn more about the game strategies and different things. But the guy teaching it was like, well, you have a weak slice, which is a terminology that only the people who play Twilight Imperium a lot, or more than twice, or 3 times would use to say, like, you don't have a strong start, or you don't have a good section of the galaxy that is yours, as strong as it could be. So he was trying to explain to my buddy, oh, you have a weak slice, you have a blah, 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 blah. I mean, this is all terminology that no one else at the table was going to understand or even appreciate. So when you're coming to a game as big and complex as Twilight Imperium, and you're using shark lingo, and you're trying to tell people how to play, not teaching them, you're telling them how to play, I don't think that's a good strategy. And ultimately, again, it was like, my buddy needed to understand the game mechanics, which he was confused on a couple of things early on, but he wised up, and he did what he needed to do, and he did win. He played the way he wanted to play, and that was effective. And, the guy who was he really knew Twilight Imperium well, and he could teach it, like, he lost. He didn't win. And maybe it's just a matter of, like, you can listen to podcasts, you can read about strategies, but when you're playing a game with people, particularly people you don't know, you got to figure out how to play the table you're at, not what you think you're playing or how you're expecting to teach someone how they're going to go play the game. I don't know. But much thanks to the guy who did teach us. And now I have a big, gigantic game on my shelf that has a lesser chance of never being played. I will probably play my copy of Twilight Imperium now. I have learned it. I know that I like it a whole lot. And I'm pretty confident I could teach it and teach it pretty well. So much so that I'm already like, oh, do I want to buy the expansion? I don't know. They would be cool. There's cool stuff in here. And it's an understatement. There's so much cool stuff in here. Tons of cool stuff. So if you've not played Twilight Imperium and you think you might like to try it, I would definitely recommend it. It's very cool. It's not a historical war game, that's true. But if you like sci-fi stuff, I mean, it's cool. It's cool. It's got space cats and peace turtles. And that's the name of the podcast, by the way. So if you're interested, you can go listen to that podcast, because me and my buddy all did, and we've been texting a little bit about the game since. So definitely some cool stuff here, guys. So that was Saturday. That took me up through, again, 3:30 in the morning, which made going to sleep a really hard thing to do, knowing that I was going to have another game like in 6 hours, which we'll talk about next. Okay, at last we're at the final game that I played at GameON 2022, and this is Versailles 1919, a game by Mark Herman and Jeff Engelstein. This is technically the 3rd game in the Great Statesman series. It doesn't say that on the box, but it says it on the rule books, playbook. And what was interesting is, like, okay, I had gotten maybe 5 or 6 hours of sleep or less before playing this, and I was a little worried. I'm like, oh gosh, I'm gonna feel like crap. I must have been on a good REM cycle, because I woke up, I felt okay, I got my stuff packed up and checked out of my hotel room and got arranged for the final game before heading home for the day. And once again, I got to play with Justin Justigard, and it was one other guy. We decided to play it 3-player, so this can play up to 4. You can play down to solitaire if you want. We played it 3 players, which worked okay. But Justin was very helpful in teaching the game, and he had told me prior that, like, I'm going to teach you the game in like 10 minutes. Like, it's not that complicated. You're going to get it. And he was totally right. Like, this is actually a very easy game to get to play and understand, and the sort of power politics and, like, wheeling and dealing and actions become pretty intuitive pretty quickly. So much so that it's like, when I think about Churchill and Pericles, the other games in the series, like, both of those are a lot more complicated to try to explain than this game ended up being. I mean, it wowed me how easy this is to play. And I also have a very general sense that this is a very good game for people who, because it's obviously not a war game, it's much more like a Euro game. Like, you could definitely get Euro players to play this game. Like, I think my wife would really enjoy this game. Now, that she plays war games, by the way, I should say. So it's not like, oh, this is... that is not a statement to diminish this game. It's like, this is a game with a cool historical detail that I think has a much broader reach than even just the normal war game community. So we played this. Justin played the French, the other person played British, and I played the Americans, which meant that Italy, which is the other major player power, was sort of not part of the regular action phase. Now, this game, I'll say right away, there's a few things I would like to enhance this game with. Here's your playbook. Here's the rule book, and here's where you can see it's very understated, but the Great Statesman series right there. The rule book comes in ultimately at 15 pages, and it's fine. Again, if you have a good teacher who can explain it, you don't even need to be spending much time doing that. There's some solo play aid stuff. This is my copy. We didn't play my copy. We played, it might have been Justin's copy. So I haven't punched any of my stuff. But I don't even think we used this. We just counted it manually and it worked fine. But so the game map, and I'm not going to bust it all out, is arranged just like holding boxes for the different cards and the different pieces, and it's aesthetically arranged to look like meeting rooms, like the ambassadors and negotiators, whatever, during the Versailles meetings in 1919 after World War I, right? That's the whole basis of this game, is you are playing to determine the post-World War I world and how much your power has what it wants in place. It includes wooden pieces, which I as mentioned earlier in this video, if you've been watching the whole dang thing, I tolerate them, and in this case, the cubes are fine. They actually serve the purpose they need to serve in this game, which is fine. There's a die, which is really used to help determine uprisings that can happen in various parts of the world, but the game is principally all around these issues. Move a couple of these cards out of the way. So, I believe I have properly incorporated the errata cards in here. There were some errata cards that were published, which is why the shrink wrap is off these cards. But you can see, like, well, what happens to the Rhineland after World War I? Well, it can remain with Germany, which makes France unhappy. And I think that reduces uprising chance in Europe. You could have it be French occupied, which raises the uprising chance in Europe. Or you can totally give it to France as an annexation, in which case has some market impacts, and Italy is unhappy. Europe has a higher chance of uprisings. But if you get control of this issue card, regardless of which of these you pick, you're going to have 6 victory points at the end of the game. So there's all kinds of these things, like what happens to Prussia. Let's see, there's a couple in here that are a little nebulous. You got to watch out for. Let's see if I can find it really quick. There are league issues, so have to deal with the League of Nations, which we understand didn't exactly have long-term impact that I think was desired, right? I think it's that strange to say. I'm looking for a very particular card. There's some stuff in here that I'm sure, like, some folks are going to be a little, I don't know, bothered by politically. So there's, like, racial equality, including the League Charter, makes America unhappy. Otherwise, I mean, all of these are just, they're really interesting. Like, what's fun is to look at these issues and be like, well, what are the options? Like, what were the options on the table at the time? Slovenia and Croatia. It's a Balkan issue. Both get to be independent. You get self-determination increases, and Italy is happy, or unhappy, or really unhappy. You got all sorts of these. There's a lot of different things in here. Now, you're going to notice right away, there's a lot of blank space on these cards. So did the cards actually need to be this big? I don't know. I don't think so. Kind of a waste. And I understand the cuneiform, cuneiform interpretation of symbols to mean something in game terms. This means an industry. This means something else. This is France being unhappy. Like, it's gameplay by emoticons, where, I mean, any other game might simply say, like, France in bold loses 3 happiness, and, like, 3 happiness is also in bold or something, right? Like, you can use words and just say it. Here, I mean, I guess you could be like, this is language agnostic for the most part. Like, if you don't speak English or don't read English very well, you could kind of get by with just looking at the symbols. It's a little weird. But you really spend most of your time bidding. You're basically constantly bidding in this game. You're bidding your influence cubes, all this stuff, on issues as an action, and then occasionally settling an issue, allowing either yourself or someone else to win that issue and get to decide the action for the issue and getting the victory points. The discs are representing military power, and what can happen is if you pick certain results for issues, that can increase the likelihood of uprisings in a particular area, which these issue cards are organized by area. So this is the Pacific, so the Pacific area. Occasionally what will happen via some of the other event cards in the decks that are in this game is that uprisings can possibly happen in those regions. So if you have won an issue and chose very volatile solutions to that given issue, it will be more volatile, which will cause uprisings, which will cause upheaval. Military units can be used to suppress some of those things, but the opportunity cost is if you demobilize those army units, you get more happiness. And there's a track. It's almost like soft victory points. The happier you are at the end of the game, the more victory points that you'll get. If you're the player with the most happiness, you'll get like 6 victory points, and then it decreases there. A very Euro game type mechanic where the first, second, third, fourth person in a given category gets a certain number of victory points at the end. So you do want to be picking things that will keep you happy or will make your opponents maybe less happy if you're being a little of a jerk. But if those things make the region really volatile, a successful uprising could mean, and I'll just use whatever card. No, that's not a good card example. Let's grab this one. Let's say that's not a good one either. All right, hold on. We're going to do this right. Balkans. Perfect. We'll find this one again. Okay. So, I need to find a better one. Okay, Montenegro is better. Okay, so let's say I won the Montenegro issue, and I picked independent. Well, that would make Italy happy, but would increase the uprising chance in the Balkans. Now, if the Balkans has a uprising succeed, we're going to look at who all has issues that they've won in the Balkans category, Balkans region. Whoever has the most, it has the potential that that person will lose that issue card and someone else will get it, which means you're going to lose victory points. So there's sort of this weird strategy where, I guess it's not weird, but it's just what you have to think about it in terms of is, I'm winning these issues, I'm getting victory points. I'm trying to keep things from being too volatile, but if I can make it a region more volatile and hurt another player, that might be a good idea. So that maybe a particular card is worth a lot of victory points. If I can get an uprising in that area, I could pry that card and its victory points from my opponent and give it to me. And then maybe I try to work on getting the uprising in that region down again, or keep it down once I'm in it. But I still have all these things that I'm trying to figure out and get victory points for. There are 2 major things that I don't like, or I wish, well, it can be modified. The game map as is thematic for the situation, but doesn't help the broader, I guess, impact of the decisions you're making. So if there is ever an expansion for Versailles 1919, or maybe somebody can just create this and put it on Board Game Geek, it'd be a lot more fun to like print out an additional, like a map of the world or something, and be able to put like labels on it to say like, okay, German East Africa is now a UK mandate. So there's like a little square over in German East Africa on this world map, and you can put a UK control marker there or something, right? Like something that takes us beyond the, here's this card that you're going to forget about, to like, is there some other way to represent this in a more flavorful way where like, okay, Constantinople, if you make it an open city, maybe there you could have a marker that way that just shows it, so that as you guys are, you know, as you're playing the game, you have some way to understand in a tangible way geographically, like what are these geopolitical decisions you're making, like where is that in the world, and what is that really doing. You can imagine it, and if you're really good at geography like me, then it's fine to imagine it, but it'd be a lot more fun to have some other physical representation of what you're doing with the history. Or else it's just a silly Euro game, right? My other issue, it's not, you can deal with this as like a historical variant kind of thing. I gotta find the right cards here. I think these are, yeah, these are good. So these are the event cards. They just kind of modify things that are happening in the game in certain ways. But what I have a real sort of trick issue with is you have these strategy cards. Now, they're cool and historical, sort of. So you have like contain communism. Churchill wins the intervention argument. Okay. This is a strategy card. So what you have several of these. And when you're playing a game, you're going to randomly make some of these available for the players to pick. And you're not necessarily going to get the ones that make the most sense for the player that you're playing, for the faction that you're playing, I should say. So let's say contain communism. Okay, well, you could make a reasonable argument that Britain, France, America, and Italy all wanted to contain communism. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily matter as much who picks this one. It might matter for Italy, but I'll explain that in a minute. Let's take a different one. Or reparations. Okay. The British and the French had a strong drive to seek reparations in German material. Okay. This one would be great for the British or the French player. America might not care as much, and Italy might not care as much. We'll do another one. 14 points. Wilson's worldview. Okay, this is clearly one that is in alignment with the American desire, and is probably not exactly what France would have wanted or Britain necessarily would have wanted, maybe at cross purposes. But this is what the Americans, you know, in theory would be wanting. There's a lot of different ones in here. Nation building, global trade. You know, some of these are just fine, right? Nothing too crazy. Now, here's the problem. Because these are randomly drawn, you could just get any old grab bag of cards. These strategy cards dictate the things that you want to do outside of your nation's immediate happiness, which you always want to manage, and the uprisings and victory points. These cards are going to set what other victory points you get and are going to have a huge impact on whether or not you win the game. So, containing communism has 4 stipulations for additional victory points. You're going to get 1 victory point for any, I think this is like imperialism something. I'm probably going to get the names of the because we're using symbols, and I don't have the rulebook open, I have to make some very basic judgment calls. But this is like any issues that were settled that provided an imperialism expansion, you get a victory point. It doesn't matter who it is, whether it's British or French. I think those are the only 2 that matter. Either way, you're going to get a victory point. And it doesn't matter if you're France or Britain or America or Italy. Per hammer and sickle symbol that's out there, you get 2 victory points. For each British naval marker that's produced by an issue resolution, you'll have a victory point. If Japan and Italy sign the Versailles Treaty, you'll get 3 victory points for each of them, Japan and Italy. So, which player faction do you think this card synergizes the most with? If you're thinking it's Britain, you would be right. This would be great for Britain. But it might not be Britain's card. And this kind of goes for a lot of other ones. I'm trying to think. I got to find the one that I got. So when I was playing the United States, and when it came to randomly pick these strategy cards, the 14 points one was not part of the set that we could pick from. And I got to pick first. The problem was none of the strategy cards really synergized with American things or any of the issue cards that were out there. I think this is the one I ended up picking, was Mobilization. So I got an extra victory point every time an issue was resolved that had to do with industry, markets, an expansion of imperialism, and per mobilized army that was still out suppressing uprisings. Now, you can see the description here. Germans are unhappy with the peace process and the armistice is breaking down. Strategy is to use military posture to dampen down German intransigence. Okay. So, if I think about this from the American perspective, you can kind of argue that the first two are maybe things that I would have wanted, where the last two are probably things I did not want or didn't necessarily want. And the bad thing was, when we played this game of ours, the three of us, that many of these issue resolutions that gave imperial things, I'm like, oh, I want that for victory points. Let's go ahead and resolve that issue that way. The problem was that would often make America unhappy. So I would get a lot of these things. So like, yeah, it gives me these things for victory points, but it makes me unhappy, which impacts my ability to get victory points. So I ended up picking a strategy card that was not very synergetic with my faction, right? Because who you play actually does matter in this game. It matters for the way you settle issues, and it should matter on your grand strategy, but for some reason this game divorces the two. Now, in reading online, comments from Mark seem to indicate that was chosen for replayability, which I guess makes sense, right? You want to mix it up a little bit. It's not the same game every time. The American player isn't trying to do the same thing every game all the time. But you should avoid these cases where they're totally divergent ideas in terms of the gameplay. It just makes you less effective at the game if you have different mechanics pulling you in, like you try to do something and it hurts you the other way. And if you're playing against someone who has a faction with a really good synergy of strategy cards, because they just happen, like the random strategy cards that were available were all very good for them, you're going to be at a disadvantage. Now, what you could do is have like a historical historical variant where the British could pick from, maybe contain communism, or what's another good one? Oh, yeah, there you go. Revanchism is an option. Try to see which one of these makes the most sense. Like, there's certain ones, like, I would want to categorize them. Oh, this is just a card. I would want to categorize some of these and say, like, okay, if you're America, pick one of, like, let's say 14 points or maybe nation building, right? Or global trade or something. Like, you're going to pick from a couple of these. Maybe isolationism is one. Like, you can pick one of a couple, but they're either going to be neutral to your nation's aims on issues, or they're going to synergize. And if you're just like, hey, I want to do a global trade game, or I want to do an isolationism game and play that, and that's the replayability, cool. But to have it completely open just means like you have this potential to screw things up. Now, I did read that if you're playing solitaire, there are bot behavior of the other player powers that, or the other factions, that basically align with one of these strategy cards, and that the bot doesn't get a strategy card, but by default is kind of acting in concert with one of those to get victory points. That would, to me, be sort of the guiding light to say, like, these are the ones you should pick. Maybe if you're playing a brand new game, you're playing with 4 people, like, you just take these cards. Like, take this card as your strategy card. This is the way that you're going to operate from the game going forward, and it's basically in alignment with what you would expect. Like, if I'm in the United States and I want self-determination, then I should have a strategy card that synergizes with all these things and makes me happy. And that will make more sense to someone than having really weird things happening at cross purposes. So I don't know. I'm not sure enough people have talked about such a historical variant option, but that's definitely how I would want to play this game in the future, is with something like that, just so that those options make a little more sense. Again, I understand why they want to mix it up a little bit, but for me, what I want is to play the history of Versailles 1919, not wacky Euro cross-purpose logic for replayability's sake. I want something a little more in line with the historical narrative, or at least give me the incentives to act historically, and then it's just going to still come down to the players making the decisions that they need to make to try to win, right? It's all good stuff. Okay, that was the last game I played. Now, before I wrap things up, I do want to comment on a couple of things. I did pick up games. So I should not have. I think I went into the convention going, I'm not going to come home with any new games, gosh darn it. I'm going to try to sell some Battles of Westeros stuff that I have that I don't want anymore. And I didn't succeed in selling it, and then I bought more stuff. They did have a board game store vendor there, and there's also a swap meet table where people are selling games for very cheap prices. So what did I get? Well, at least I'm getting things in a set. I got The Last 100 Yards, first printing from 2019, unpunched, very cheap, from someone who just didn't have time for another game system. I got that, and then at the same time, I got Volume 3 in the series, brand new, and this just came out. So I could do like a mini unboxing video here. I'm not going to do that. This is a tactical game system that has a variety of different units involved. You can see the hexes in the scale, where hexes incorporate, buildings, and so you're really kind of zoomed in. It's not like a squad level game. I think it probably says on here what it is. Small unit combat. So it's kind of in the same ballpark as ASL, or in the same ballpark as Combat Commander, but with its own rules of governing movement, combat, and everything else. But it's come highly praised, and which is why I had piqued interest in it. This being the Solomon Islands, I've been kind of on a Pacific kick lately, so that was kind of an interesting option. And Volume 2, I believe, is still available from GMT and involves airborne units in Europe. So, and there's going to be more. There's going to be more in this series. So, whether or not I'm going to get to play these anytime soon, that's sort of up in the air, and whether or not it plays well solo, I don't know. But the price points were really good. Like, this was super duper cheap, and then this was actually being sold for well under MSRP for some reason, and so I snatched them up for really cheap. So I can at least say, from a money perspective, money well spent. Hopefully the games are up my alley, but we'll see. I don't typically play tactical, but I think this is a good opportunity to give it a try. So let me know what you guys think about The Last 100 Yards as a system for the games, the missions, how they play. I'll be wanting to dig into these more in the future, and we'll see what happens. So there you go, guys. This video is immensely big. I appreciate if you stuck around for the whole thing. If you managed to do that, drop a comment. Just let me know that you stuck it out. That'd be really fun to hear. Otherwise, I hope the hyperlinks were valuable in terms of getting to the timestamps in the sections of the video that you actually cared about. Anyway, thanks guys. Thanks for watching, for listening. Hopefully we'll be doing some more videos on a great many games here in the near future. Time and busyness is always the constraint, but we'll fight through it how we can. In the meantime, guys, take care. Keep on gaming.